The Brick Moon, from the papers of Captain Frederick Ingham. Part 1. Preparation. I have no sort of objection now to telling the whole story. The subscribers, of course, have a right to know what became of their money. The astronomers may as well know all about it before they announce any more asteroids with an enormous movement in declination. And experimenters on the longitude may as well know, so that they may act advisedly in attempting another brick moon or in refusing to do so. It all began more than 30 years ago, when we were in college, as most good things begin. We were studying in the book which has gray sides and a green back, and is called Cambridge Astronomy, because it is translated from the French. We came across this business of the longitude, and as we talked, in the gloom and glamour of the old South Middle Dining Hall, we had going the usual number of students' stories about rewards offered by the Board of Longitude for discoveries in that matter. Stories, all of which, so far as I know, are lies. Like all boys, we had tried our hands at perpetual motion. For me, I was sure I could square the circle, if they would give me chalk enough. But as to this business of the longitude, it was reserved for Q to make the happy hit, and to explain it to the rest of us. Wherever Q is referred to in these pages, my brother Nathan is meant. One of his noms de plume was Nat Q. Hale, because G and Q may be silent letters. I wonder if I can explain it to an unlearned world which has not studied the book with gray sides and a green cambric back. Let us try. You know then, dear world, that when you look at the North Star, it always appears to you at just the same height above the horizon, or what is between you and the horizon, say the Dwight Schoolhouse, or the houses in Concord Street, or to me, just now, North College. You know also that, if you were to travel to the North Pole, the North Star would be just over your head, and if you were to travel to the equator, it would be just on your horizon, if you could see it at all through the red, dusty, hazy mist in the north, as you could not. If you were just halfway between pole and equator on the line between us and Canada, the North Star would be halfway up, or 45 degrees from the horizon. So you would know that you were 45 degrees from the equator. Then in Boston, you would find it was 42 degrees, 20 minutes from the horizon. So you know there that you are 42 degrees, 20 minutes from the equator. At Seattle, again, you would find it was 47 degrees, 40 minutes high. So our friends at Seattle know that they are at 47 degrees, 40 minutes from the equator. The latitude of a place, in other words, is found very easily by any observation which shows how high the North Star is. If you do not want to measure the North Star, you may take any star when it is just to north of you, and measure its height. Wait 12 hours, and if you can find it, measure its height again. Split the difference, and that is the altitude of the pole, or the latitude of you, the observer. Of course we know this, says the graduating world. Do you suppose that is what we borrow your book for, to have you spell out your miserable elementary astronomy? At which rebuff I should shrink distressed, but that a chorus of voices an octave higher comes up with, "Dear Mr. Ingham, we are ever so much obliged to you. We did not know it at all before, and you make it perfectly clear. Thank you, my dear, and you and you. We will not care what the others say. If you do understand it, or do know it, it is more than Mr. Charles Reade knew, or he would not have made his two lovers on the island guess at their latitude, as they did. If they had either of them been educated at a respectable academy for the middle classes, they would have fared better. Now about the longitude. The latitude, which you have found, measures your distance north or south from the equator or the pole. To find your longitude, you want to find your distance east or west from the meridian of Greenwich. Now, if anyone would build a good tall tower at Greenwich straight into the sky, say 100 miles into the sky, of course, if you and I were east or west of it and could see it, we could tell how far east or west we were by measuring the apparent height of the tower above our horizon. If we could see so far, when the lantern with a Drummond's light, ever so bright, on the very top of the tower, appeared to be on our horizon, we should know we were 873 miles away from it. The top of the tower would answer for us as the North Star does when we are measuring the latitude. If we were nearer, our horizon would make a longer angle with the line from the top to our place of vision. If we were farther away, We should need a higher tower, but nobody will build any such tower at Greenwich or elsewhere on that meridian or on any meridian. You see that to be of use to the half the world nearest to it, it would have to be so high that the diameter of the world would seem nothing in proportion. And then, for the other half of the world, you would have to erect another tower as high on the other side. It was this difficulty that made Q suggest the expedient of the brick moon. For you see that if, by good luck, there were a ring like Saturn's which stretched round the world, above Greenwich and the meridian of Greenwich, and if it would stay above Greenwich, turning with the world, anyone who wanted to measure his longitude or distance from Greenwich would look out of window and see how high this ring was above his horizon. At Greenwich it would be over his head exactly. At New Orleans, which is quarter round the world from Greenwich, it would be just in his horizon. A little west of New Orleans you would begin to look for the other half of the ring on the west instead of the east, and if you went a little west of the Fiji Islands, the ring would be over your head again. So if we only had a ring like that, not round the equator of the world, as Saturn's ring is around Saturn, but vertical to the plane of the equator, as the brass ring of an artificial globe goes, only far higher in proportion, from that ring, said Q pensively, we could calculate the longitude. Failing that, after various propositions, he suggested the brick moon. The plan was this: if from the surface of the earth by a gigantic pea shooter you could shoot a pea upward from Greenwich, aimed northward as well as upward. If you drove it so fast and far that when its power of ascent was exhausted and it began to fall, it should clear the earth and pass outside the North Pole. If you had given it sufficient power to get it half round the earth without touching, that pea would clear the earth forever. It would continue to rotate above the North Pole, above the Fiji Island place, above the South Pole and Greenwich, forever, with the impulse with which it had first cleared our atmosphere and attraction. If only we could see that pea as it revolved in that convenient orbit, then we could measure the longitude from that, as soon as we knew how high the orbit was, as well as if it were the ring of Saturn. But a pea is so small. Yes, said Q, but we must make a large pea. Then we fell to work on plans for making the pea very large and very light. Large, that it might be seen far away by storm-tossed navigators. Light, that it might be the easier blown 4,000 and odd miles into the air, lest it should fall on the heads of the Greenlanders or the Patagonians, lest they should be injured and the world lose its new moon. But of course, all this lath and plaster had to be given up, for the motion through the air would set fire to this moon, just as it does to other aerolites, and all your lath and plaster would gather into a few white drops which no Rosse telescope even could discern. No, said Q bravely, at the least it must be very substantial. It must stand fire well, very well. Iron will not answer. It must be brick. We must have a brick moon. Then we had to calculate its size. You can see on the old moon an edifice 200 feet long with any of the fine refractors of our day, but no such refractors as those can be carried by the poor little fishermen whom we wanted to befriend, the bones of whose ships lie white on so many cliffs, their names unreported at any Lloyd's or by any Ross, themselves the owners and their sons the crew. On the other hand, we did not want our moon 250,000 miles away, as the old moon is, which I will call the Thornbush moon, for distinction. We did not care how near it was, indeed, if it were only far enough away to be seen, in practice, from almost the whole world. There must be a little strip where they could not see it from the surface, unless we threw it infinitely high. But they need not look from the surface, said Q. They might climb to the masthead, and if they did not see it at all, they would know that they were 90 degrees from the meridian. This difficulty about what we call the strip, however, led to an improvement in the plan, which made it better in every way. It was clear that even if the strip were quite wide, the moon would have to be a good way off, and, in proportion, hard to see. If, however, we would satisfy ourselves with a moon 4,000 miles away, that could be seen on the Earth's surface for 3,000 or 4,000 miles on each side, and twice 3,000 or 6,000 is 1/4 of the largest circumference of the Earth. We did not dare have it nearer than 4,000 miles, since even at that distance it would be eclipsed 3 hours out of every night, and we wanted it bright and distinct, and not of that lurid copper eclipse color. But at 4,000 miles distance, the moon could be seen by a belt of observers 6 or 8,000 miles in diameter. Start then 2 moons. This was my contribution to the plan. Suppose one over the meridian of Greenwich and the other over that of New Orleans. Take care that there's a little difference in the radii of their orbits, lest they collide some foul day. Then, in most places, one or other, perhaps 2, will come in sight. So much the less risk of clouds, and everywhere there may be one except when it is cloudy. Neither need be more than 4,000 miles off, so much the larger and more beautiful will they be. If on the old Thornbush moon, old Herschel with his reflector could see a townhouse 200 feet long, on the brick moon, young Herschel will be able to see a dab of mortar 1.5 feet long, if he wants to. And people without the reflector, with their opera glasses, will be able to see sufficiently well. And to this they agreed, that eventually there must be 2 brick moons. Indeed, it were better that there should be 4, as each must be below the horizon half the time. That is only as many as Jupiter has. But it was also agreed that we might begin with 1. Why we settled on 200 feet of diameter, I hardly know. I think it was from the statement of dear John Ferrars about the impossibility of there being a state house 200 feet long not yet discovered on the sunny side of old Thornbush. That somehow made 200 our fixed point. Besides, a moon of 200 feet diameter did not seem quite unmanageable. Yet it was evident that a smaller moon would be of no use, unless we meant to have them near the world, when there would be so many that they would be confusing and eclipsed most of the time. And 4,000 miles is a good way off to see a moon even 200 feet in diameter. Small though we made them on paper, these 200-foot moons were still too much for us. Of course, we meant to build them hollow. But even if hollow, there must be some thickness, and the quantity of brick would at best be enormous. Then to get them up. The pea-shooter, of course, was only an illustration. It was long after that time that Rodman and other guns sent iron balls 5 or 6 miles in distance, say 2 miles, more or less in height. Iron is much heavier than hollow brick, but you can build no gun with a bore of 200 feet now. Far less could you then. No. Q again suggested the method of shooting off the moon. It was not to be by any of your sudden explosions. It was to be done as all great things are done, by the gradual and silent accumulation of power. You all know that a flywheel, heavy, very heavy on the circumference, light, very light within it, was made to save up power, from the time when it was produced to the time when it was wanted. Yes? Then before we began even to build the moon, before we even began to make the brick, we would build 2 gigantic flywheels. The diameter of each should be ever so great, the circumference heavy beyond all precedent, and thundering strong, so that no temptation might burst it. They should revolve, their edges nearly touching, in opposite directions for years if it were necessary, to accumulate power, driven by some waterfall now wasted to the world. One should be a little heavier than the other. When the brick moon was finished and all was ready, IT should be gently rolled down a gigantic groove provided for it, till it lighted on the edge of both wheels at the same instant. Of course it would not rest there, not the 10,000th part of a second. It would be snapped upward as a drop of water from a grindstone. Upward and upward, but the heavier wheel would have deflected it a little from the vertical. Upward and northward it would rise, therefore, till it had passed the axis of the world. It would, of course, feel the world's attraction all the time, which would bend its flight gently, but still it would leave the world more and more behind. Upward still, but now southward, till it had traversed more than 180 degrees of a circle. Little resistance, indeed, after it had cleared the 40 or 50 miles of visible atmosphere. "Now let it fall," said Q, inspired with the vision. "Let it fall, and the sooner the better. The curve it is now on will forever clear the world, and over the meridian of that lonely waterfall, if only we have rightly adjusted the gigantic flies, will forever revolve, in its obedient orbit, the brick moon, the blessing of all seamen, as constant in all change as its older sister has been fickle, and the second son of all lovers upon the waves. and of all girls left behind them. Amen, we cried, and then we sat in silence till the clock struck 10, then shook each other gravely by the hand and left the south middle dining hall. Of waterfalls there were plenty that we knew. Flywheels could be built of oak and pine and hooped with iron. Flywheels did not discourage us. But brick? One brick is, say, 64 cubic inches only. This moon, though we made it hollow, see, it must take 12 million brick. The brick alone will cost $60,000. The brick alone would cost $60,000. There the scheme of the brick moon hung, an airy vision for 17 years, the years that changed us from young men into men. The brick alone, $60,000. For, to boys who have still left a few of their college bills unpaid, who cannot think of buying that lovely little Elsevier which Smith has for sale at auction, of which Smith does not dream of the value, $60,000 seems as intangible as 60 million sestertia. Clark, second. How much are 60 million sestertia stated in cowries? How much in currency, gold being at 1.37 quarter? Right. Go up. Stop, I forget myself. So to resume, the project of the brick moon hung in the ideal, an airy vision, a vision as lovely and as distant as the brick moon itself. At this calm moment of midnight when I write, as it poises itself over the shoulder of Orion in my southern horizon. Stop, I anticipate. Let me keep, as we say in Beatles' Dime series, to the even current of my story. 17 years passed by, we were no longer boys, though we felt so. For myself, to this hour, I never enter board meeting, committee meeting, or synod, without the queer question, what would happen should anyone discover that this bearded man was only a big boy disguised? That the frock coat and the round hat are none of mine, and that if I should be spurned from the assembly as an interloper, a judicious public, learning all the facts, would give a verdict, served him right. This consideration helps me through many board meetings which would be else so dismal. What did my old copy say? Boards are made of wood, they are long and narrow, but we do not get on. 17 years after, I say, or should have said, dear Orcutt entered my room at Naguadavick again. I had not seen him since the commencement day when we parted at Cambridge. He looked the same, and yet not the same. His smile was the same, his voice, his tender look of sympathy when I spoke to him of a great sorrow, his childlike love of fun. His waistband was different, his pantaloons were different, his smooth chin was buried in a full beard, and he weighed 200 pounds if he weighed a gram. Oh, the good time we had, so like the times of old. Those were happy days for me in Naguadavick. At that moment my double was at work for me at a meeting of the publishing committee of the Sandemanian Review, so I called Orcutt up to my own snuggery, and we talked over old times, talked till tea was ready. Polly came up through the orchard and made tea for us herself there. We talked on, till 9:10 at night, and then it was that dear Orcutt asked me if I remembered the brick moon. Remember it? Of course I did. And without leaving my chair, I opened the drawer of my writing desk and handed him a portfolio full of working drawings on which I had engaged myself for my third all that winter. Orcutt was delighted. He turned them over hastily but intelligently and said, I am so glad, I could not think you had forgotten. And I have seen Brannan, and Brannan has not forgotten. Now do you know, said he, in all this railroading of mine, I have not forgotten. When I built the great tunnel for the Catawissa and Opelousas, by which we got rid of the old inclined plains, there was never a stone bigger than a peach stone within 200 miles of us. I baked the brick of that tunnel on the line with my own kilns. Ingham, I have made more brick, I believe, than any man living in the world. Every man, says Dr. Peabody, should have a vocation and an avocation. To which I add, a third. You are the providential man, said I. Am I not, Fred? More than that, said he. I have succeeded in things the world counts worth more than brick. I have made brick and I have made money. One of us make money? Asked I, amazed. Even so, said dear Orcutt, one of us has made money. And he proceeded to tell me how. It was not in building tunnels nor in making brick. No, it was by buying up the original stock of the Catawissa and Opelousas, at a moment when that stock had hardly a nominal price in the market. There were the first mortgage bonds and the second mortgage bonds and the third, and I know not how much floating debt, and worse than all, the reputation of the road lost and deservedly lost. Every locomotive it had was asthmatic. Every car it had bore the marks of unprecedented accidents for which no one was to blame. Rival lines, I know not how many, were cutting each other's throats for its legitimate business. At this juncture, Dear George invested all his earnings as a contractor in the despised original stock. He actually bought it for 3¼ %. Good shares that had cost a round hundred to every wretch who had subscribed. $6,800, every cent he had, did George thus invest. Then he went himself to the trustees of the first mortgage, to the trustees of the second, and to the trustees of the third, and told them what he had done. Now it is personal presence that moves the world. Dear Orcutt has found that out since, if he did not know it before. The trustees, who would have sniffed had George written to them, turned round from their desks and begged him to take a chair when he came to talk with them. Had he put every penny he was worth into that stock? Then it was worth something which they did not know of, for George Orcutt was no fool about railroads. The man who bridged the lower Rapidan when a freshet was running was no fool. What were his plans? George did not tell, no, not to lordly trustees, what his plans were. He had plans, but he kept them to himself. All he told them was that he had plans. On those plans he had staked his all. Now, would they or would they not agree to put him in charge of the running of that road for 12 months on a nominal salary? The superintendent they had had was a rascal. He had proved that by running away. They knew that George was not a rascal. He knew that he could make this road pay expenses, pay bondholders, and pay a dividend, a thing no one else had dreamed of for 20 years. Could they do better than try him? Of course they could not, and they knew they could not. Of course they sniffed and talked and waited and pretended they did not know, and that they must consult and so forth and so on. But of course they all did try him on his own terms. He was put in charge of the running of that road. In 1 week he showed he should redeem it. In 3 months he did redeem it. He advertised boldly the first day, infant children at treble price. The novelty attracted instant remark, and it showed many things. First, it showed he was a humane man who wished to save human life. He would leave these innocents in their cradles where they belonged. Second, and chiefly, the world of travelers saw that the Crichton, the Amatus, the perfect chevalier of the future, had arisen, a railroad manager caring for the comfort of his passengers. The first week, the number of the C&O's passengers was doubled. In a week or two more, freight began to come in driblets on the line which its owners had gone over. As soon as the shops could turn them out, some cars were put on, with arms on which travelers could rest their elbows, with headrests where they could take naps if they were weary. These excited so much curiosity that one was exhibited in the museum at Catawissa and another at Opelousas. It may not be generally known that the received car of the American roads was devised to secure a premium offered by the Pawtucket and Podunk Company. Their receipts were growing so large that they feared they should forfeit their charter. They advertised, therefore, for a car in which no man could sleep at night or rest by day, in which the backs should be straight, the heads of passengers unsupported, the feet entangled in a vise, the elbows always knocked by the passing conductor. The pattern was produced which immediately came into use on all the American roads, but on the Catawissa and Opelousas, this time-honored pattern was set aside. Of course, you see the result. Men went hundreds of miles out of their way to ride on the C&O. The third mortgage was paid off, a reserve fund was piled up for the second. The trustees of the first lived in dread of being paid, and George's stock, which he bought at 3¼ rose to 147 before 2 years had gone by. So was it that, as we sat together in the snuggery, George was worth well nigh $300,000. Some of his eggs were in the basket where they were laid. Some he had taken out and placed in other baskets. Some in nests where various hens were brooding over them. Sound eggs they were, wherever placed. And such was the victory of which George had come to tell. One of us had made money. On his way he had seen Brannan. Brannan, the pure-minded, right-minded, shifty man of tact, man of brain, man of heart, and man of word, who held New Altona in the hollow of his hand. Brannan had made no money, not he, nor ever will. But Brannan could do much what he pleased in this world without money. For whenever Brannon studied the rights and the wrongs of any enterprise, all men knew that what Brannon decided about it was well nigh the eternal truth, and therefore all men of sense were accustomed to place great confidence in his prophecies. But more than this and better, Brannon was an unconscious dog who believed in the people. So when he knew what was the right and what was the wrong, he could stand up before 2,000 or 3,000 people and tell them what was right and what was wrong, and tell them with the same simplicity and freshness with which he would talk to little Horace on his knee. Of the thousands who heard him there would not be 1 in 100 who knew that this was eloquence. They were fain to say, as they sat in their shops talking, that Brannon was not eloquent. Nay, they went so far as to regret that Brannon was not eloquent. If he were only as eloquent as Carker was, or as Barker was, how excellent he would be. But when, a month after, it was necessary for them to do anything about the thing he had been speaking of, they did what Brannon had told them to do, forgetting, most likely, that he had ever told them, and fancying that these were their own ideas, which, in fact, had, from his liquid, ponderous, transparent, and invisible common sense, distilled unconsciously into their being. I wonder whether Brannon ever knew that he was eloquent. What I knew, and what dear George knew, was that he was one of the leaders of men. Courage, my friends, we are steadily advancing to the brick moon. For George had stopped and seen Brannon, and Brannon had not forgotten. 17 years Brannon had remembered, and not a ship had been lost on a lee shore because her longitude was wrong. Not a baby had wailed its last as it was ground between wrecked spar and cruel rock. Not a swollen corpse unknown had been flung up upon the sand and been buried with a nameless epitaph. But Brannon had recollected the brick moon, and had, in the memory chamber, which rejected nothing, stored away the story of the horror. And now George was ready to consecrate a round 100,000 to the building of the moon, and Brannon was ready, in the 1,000 ways in which wise men move the people to and fro, to persuade them to give to us 100,000 more. And George had come to ask me if I were not ready to undertake with them the final great effort, of which our old calculations were the embryo. For this I was now to contribute the mathematical certainty and the lore borrowed from naval science, which should blossom and bear fruit when the brick moon was snapped like a cherry from the ways on which it was built, was launched into the air by power gathered from 1,000 freshets, and, poised at last in its own pre-calculated region of the ether, should begin its course of eternal blessings in one unchanging meridian. Vision of beneficence and wonder. Of course I consented. Oh, that you were not so eager for the end. Oh, that I might tell you, what now you will never know, of the great campaign which we then and there inaugurated. How the horrible loss of the royal martyr, whose longitude was 3 degrees Auri, startled the whole world and gave us a point to start from. How I explained to George that he must not subscribe the $100,000 in a moment. It must come in bits, when the cause needed a stimulus or the public needed encouragement. How we caught neophyte editors and explained to them enough to make them think the moon was well nigh their own invention and their own thunder. How, beginning in Boston, we sent round to all the men of science, all those of philanthropy, and all those of commerce, 3,000 circulars inviting them to a private meeting at George's parlors at the Revere. How, besides ourselves and some nice, respectable-looking old gentlemen Brannon had brought over from Podunk with him, paying their fares both ways, there were present only 3 men, all adventurers whose projects had failed, besides the representatives of the press. How, of these representatives, some understood the whole, and some understood nothing. How the next day all gave us first-rate notices. How a few days after, in the lower horticultural hall, we had our first public meeting. How Halliburton brought us 50 people who loved him, his Bible class, most of them, to help fill up. How, besides these, there were not 3 persons whom we had not asked personally, or one who could invent an excuse to stay away. How we had hung the walls with intelligible and unintelligible diagrams. How I opened the meeting. Of that meeting, indeed, I must tell something. First I spoke. I did not pretend to unfold the scheme. I did not attempt any rhetoric. But I did not make any apologies. I told them simply of the dangers of lee shores. I told them when they were most dangerous, when seamen came upon them unawares. I explained to them that, though the costly chronometer, frequently adjusted, made a delusive guide to the voyager who often made a harbor, still the adjustment was treacherous, the instrument beyond the use of the poor, and that, once astray, its error increased forever. I said that we believed we had a method which, if the means were supplied for the experiment, would give the humblest fisherman the very certainty of sunrise and of sunset in his calculations of his place upon the world. And I said that whenever a man knew his place in this world, it was always likely all would go well. Then I sat down. Then dear George spoke, simply but very briefly. He said he was a stranger to the Boston people, and that those who knew him at all knew he was not a talking man. He was a civil engineer, and his business was to calculate and to build, and not to talk. But he had come here to say that he had studied this new plan for the longitude from the top to the bottom, and that he believed in it through and through. There was his opinion, if that was worth anything to anybody. If that meeting resolved to go forward with the enterprise, or if anybody proposed to, he should offer his services in any capacity, and without any pay, for its success. If he might only work as a bricklayer, he would work as a bricklayer. For he believed on his soul that the success of this enterprise promised more for mankind than any enterprise which was ever likely to call for the devotion of his life. And to the good of mankind, he said very simply, "My life is devoted." Then he sat down. Then Brannan got up. Up to this time, excepting that George had dropped this hint about bricklaying, nobody had said a word about the moon, far less hinted what it was to be made of. So Ben had the whole to open. He did it as if he had been talking to a bright boy of 10 years old. He made those people think that he respected them as his equals. But in fact, he chose every word, as if not one of them knew anything. He explained as if it were rather more simple to explain than to take for granted. But he explained as if, were they talking, they might be explaining to him. He led them from point to point, oh, so much more clearly than I have been leading you, till as their mouths dropped a little open in their eager interest, and their lids forgot to wink in their gaze upon his face, and so their eyebrows seemed a little lifted in curiosity, till, I say, each man felt as if he were himself the inventor, who had bridged difficulty after difficulty, as if indeed the whole were too simple to be called difficult or complicated. The only wonder was that the Board of Longitude, or the Emperor Napoleon, or the Smithsonian, or somebody, had not sent this little planet on its voyage of blessing long before. Not a syllable that you would have called rhetoric, not a word that you would have thought prepared. And then Brannan sat down. That was Ben Brannan's way. For my part, I like it better than eloquence. Then I got up again. We would answer any questions, I said. We represented people who were eager to go forward with this work. Alas, except Q, all of those represented were on the stage. We could not go forward without the general assistance of the community. It was not an enterprise which the government could be asked to favor. It was not an enterprise which would yield 1 penny of profit to any human being. We had therefore, purely on the ground of its benefit to mankind, brought it before an assembly of Boston men and women. Then there was a pause, and we could hear our watches tick and our hearts beat. Dear George asked me in a whisper if he should say anything more, but I thought not. The pause became painful, and then Tom Coram, Prince of Merchants, rose. Had any calculation been made of the probable cost of the experiment of 1 moon? I said the calculations were on the table. The brick alone would cost $60,000. Mr. Orcutt had computed that $214,729 would complete 2 flywheels and 1 moon. This made no allowance for whitewashing the moon, which was not strictly necessary. The flywheels and water power would be equally valuable for the succeeding moons, if any were attempted, and therefore the second moon could be turned off, it was hoped, for $159,732. Thomas Coram had been standing all the time I spoke, and in an instant he said, "I am no mathematician, but I have had a ship ground to pieces under me on the Laccadives because our chronometer was wrong. You need $250,000 to build your first moon. I will be one of 20 men to furnish the money, or I will pay $10,000 tomorrow for this purpose to any person who may be named as treasurer, to be repaid to me if the moon is not finished this day 20 years. That was as long a speech as Tom Coram ever made, but it was pointed. The small audience tapped applause. Orcutt looked at me, and I nodded. "I will be another of the 20 men," cried he. "And I another," said an old bluff Englishman whom nobody had invited, who proved to be a Mr. Robert Bowle, a Sheffield man who came in from curiosity. He stopped after the meeting, said he should leave the country the next week, and I have never seen him since. But his bill of exchange came all the same. That was all the public subscribing. Enough more than we had hoped for. We tried to make Coram treasurer, but he refused. We had to make Halliburton treasurer, though we should have liked a man better known than he then was. Then we adjourned. Some nice ladies then came up and gave one $1 and one $5 and one $50 and so on, and some men who have stuck by ever since. I always, in my own mind, call each of those women Damaris, and each of those men Dionysius. But those are not their real names. How I am wasting time on an old story. Then some of these ladies came the next day and proposed a fair, and out of that, 6 months after, grew the great Longitude Fair that you will all remember, if you went to it I am sure. And the papers the next day gave us first-rate reports, and then 2 by 2, with our subscription books, we went at it. But I must not tell the details of that subscription. There were 2 or 3 men who subscribed $5,000 each, because they were perfectly certain the amount would never be raised. They wanted, for once, to get the credit of liberality for nothing. There were many men and many women who subscribed from $1 up to 1,000, not because they cared a straw for the longitude, nor because they believed in the least in the project, but because they believed in Brannan, in Orcutt, in Q, or in me. Love goes far in this world of ours. Some few men subscribed because others had done it. It was the thing to do, and they must not be out of fashion. And 3 or 4, at least, subscribed because each hour of their lives there came up the memory of the day when the news came that the was lost, George or Harry or John, and they knew that George or Harry or John might have been at home, had it been easier than it is to read the courses of the stars. Fair, subscriptions, and Orcutt's reserve, we counted up $162,000, or nearly so. There would be a little more when all was paid in, but we could not use a cent, except Orcutt's and our own little subscriptions, till we had got the whole. And at this point it seemed as if the whole world was sick of us, and that we had gathered every penny that was in store for us. The orange was squeezed dry. Part 2, How We Built It. The orange was squeezed dry, and how little any of us knew, skillful George Orcutt, thoughtful Ben Brannan, loyal Halliburton, ingenious Q, or poor painstaking I. How little we knew, or any of us, where was another orange, or how we could mix malic acid and tartaric acid and citric acid and auric acid and sugar and water so as to imitate orange juice and fill up the bank account enough to draw in the conditioned subscriptions, and so begin to build the moon. How often, as I lay awake at night, have I added up the different subscriptions in some new order, as if that would help the matter, and how steadily they have come out $162,000, or even less, when I must needs, in my sleepiness, forget somebody's name. So Halliburton put into railroad stocks all the money he collected, and the rest of us ground on at our mills, or flew up on our own wings towards heaven. Thus Orcutt built more tunnels, Q prepared for more commencements, Halliburton calculated more policies, Ben Brannan created more civilization, and I, as I could, healed the hurt of my people of Naguadavick for the months there were left to me of my stay in that thriving town. None of us had the wit to see how the problem was to be wrought out further. No. The best things come to us when we have faithfully and well made all the preparation and done our best, but they come in some way that is none of ours. So was it now, that to build the brick moon it was necessary that I should be turned out of Naguadavick ignominiously, and that Jeff Davis and some 7 or 8 other bad men should create the Great Rebellion. Hear how it happened. Dennis Shea, my double, otherwise indeed called by my name and legally so, undid me, as my friends suppose, one evening at a public meeting called by poor Isaacs in Naguadavick. Of that transaction I have no occasion here to tell the story. But of that transaction, one consequence is that the brick moon now moves in ether. I stop writing to rest my eye upon it through a little telescope of Alvan Clark's here, which is always trained near it. It is moving on as placidly as ever. It came about thus. The morning after poor Dennis, whom I have long since forgiven, made his extraordinary speeches, without any authority from me, in the town hall at Naguadavick, I thought, and my wife agreed with me, that we had better both leave town with the children. Ochmody, our dear friend, thought so too. We left in the 7 o'clock accommodation for Skowhegan, and so came to Township No. 9 in the 3D range, and there for years we resided. That whole range of townships was set off under a provision admirable in its character, that the first settled minister in each town should receive 100 acres of land as the minister's grant, and the first settled schoolmaster 80. To No. 9, therefore, I came. I constituted a little Sandemanian church. Ochmody and Delafield came up and installed me, and with these hands I built the cabin in which, with Polly and the little ones, I have since spent many happy nights and days. This is not the place for me to publish a map, which I have by me, of No. 9, nor an account of its many advantages for settlers. Should I ever print my papers called Stay-at-Home Robinsons, it will be easy with them to explain its topography and geography. Suffice it now to say that, with Alice and Bertha and Polly, I took tramps up and down through the lumbermen's roads and soon knew the general features of the lay of the land. Nor was it long, of course, before we came out one day upon the curious landslides which have more than once averted the flow of the little Carrituck River, where it has washed the rocks away so far as to let down one section more of the overlying yielding yellow clay. Think how my eyes flashed and my wife's as, struggling though a wilderness of moosewood, we came out one afternoon on this front of yellow clay. Yellow clay, of course, when properly treated by fire, is brick. Here we were surrounded by forests only waiting to be burned. Yonder was clay, only waiting to be baked. Polly looked at me, and I looked at her, and with one voice we cried out, "The moon!" For here was this shouting river at our feet, whose power had been running to waste since the day when the Laurentian hills first heaved themselves above the hot Atlantic. And that day, I am informed by Mr. Agassiz, was the first day in the history of this solid world. Here was water power enough for 40 flywheels, were it necessary to send heavenward 20 moons. Here was solid timber enough for 100 dams, yet only one was necessary to give motion to the flywheels. Here was retirement, freedom from criticism, and escape from the journalists, who would not embarrass us by telling of every cracked brick which had to be rejected from the structure. We had lived in No. 9 now for 6 weeks, and not an own correspondent of them all had yet told what Rev. Mr. Ingham had for dinner. Of course, I wrote to George Ork at once of our great discovery, and he came up to examine the situation. To examine this, it pleased him. He could not take the site I proposed for the dam, because this very clay there made the channel treacherous, and there was danger that the stream would work out a new career. But lower down we found a stony gorge with which George was satisfied. He traced out a line for a railway by which, of their own weight, the brick cars could run to the centrings. He showed us where, with some excavations, the flywheels could be placed exactly above the great mill wheels, that no power might be wasted, and explained to us how, when the gigantic structure was finished, the brick moon would gently roll down its ways upon the rapid wheels, to be launched instant into the sky. Shall I ever forget that happy October day of anticipation? We spent many of those October days in tentative surveys. Alice and Bertha were our chain men, intelligent and obedient. I drove for George his stakes, or I cut away his brush, or I raised and lowered the shield at which he sighted, and at noon Polly appeared with her baskets, and we would dine al fresco, on a pretty point which, not many months after, was wholly covered by the eastern end of the dam. When the field work was finished, we retired to the cabin for days, and calculated and drew and calculated. Estimates for feeding Irishmen, estimates of hay for mules. George was sure he could work mules better than oxen. Estimates for cement, estimates for the preliminary sawmills, estimates for rail, for the little brick road, for wheels, for spikes, and for cutting ties. What did we not estimate for? On a basis almost wholly new, you will observe. For here the brick would cost us less than our old conceptions. Our water power cost us almost nothing, but our stores and our wages would cost us much more. These estimates are now to me very curious, a monument indeed to dear George's memory, that in the result they proved so accurate. I would gladly print them here at length, with some illustrative cuts, but that I know the impatience of the public and its indifference to detail. If we are ever able to print a proper memorial of George, that perhaps will be the fitter place for them. Suffice it to say that with the subtractions thus made from the original estimates, even with the additions forced upon us by working in a wilderness, George was satisfied that a money charge of $197,327 would build and start the moon. As soon as we had determined the site, we marked off 80 acres, which contained all the essential localities, up and down the little Caratuk River. I engaged George for the first schoolmaster in number 9, and he took these 80 acres for the schoolmaster's reservation. Alice and Bertha went to school to him the next day, taking lessons in civil engineering. And I wrote to the Bingham trustees to notify them that I had engaged a teacher and that he had selected his land. Of course, we remembered still that we were near $40,000 short of the new estimates, and also that much of our money would not be paid us, but on condition that $250,000 were raised. But George said that his own subscription was wholly unhampered. With that, we would go to work on the preliminary work of the dam and on the flies. Then, if the flies would hold together, and they should hold if mortise and iron could hold them, they might be at work summers and winters, days and nights, storing up power for us. This would encourage the subscribers. It would encourage us, and all this preliminary work would be out of the way when we were really ready to begin upon the moon. Brannan, Halliburton, and Q readily agreed to this when they were consulted. They were the other trustees under an instrument which we had got St. Leger to draw up. George gave up as soon as he might his other appointments, and taught me meanwhile where and how I was to rig a little sawmill to cut some necessary lumber. I engaged a gang of men to cut the timber for the dam and to have it ready, and with the next spring we were well at work on the dam and on the flies. These needed, of course, the most solid foundation. The least irregularity of their movement might send the moon awry. The St. Leger of these stories was Francis Brown Hayes, H.C. 1839. Ah me, would I not gladly tell the history of every bar of iron which was bent into the tires of those flies, and of every log which was mortised into its place in the dam, nay, of every curling mass of foam which played in the eddies beneath when the dam was finished, and the waste water ran so smoothly over? Alas, that one drop should be wasted of water that might move a world, although a small one. I almost dare say that I remember each and all these. With such hope and happiness did I lend myself, as I could, each day to the great enterprise, lending to dear George, who was here and there and everywhere, and was this and that and everybody, lending to him, I say, such poor help as I could lend in whatever way. We waked in the 2 cabins in those happy days just before the sun came up, when the birds were in their loudest clamor of morning joy. Wrapped each in a blanket, George and I stepped out from our doors, each trying to call the other, and often meeting on the grass between. We ran to the river and plunged in, oh how cold it was, laughed and screamed like boys, rubbed ourselves aglow, and ran home to build Polly's fire beneath the open chimney which stood beside my cabin. The bread had risen in the night, the water soon boiled above the logs. The children came laughing out upon the grass, barefoot, and fearless of the dew. Then Polly appeared with her gridiron and bear steak, or with her griddle and eggs, and in fewer minutes than this page has cost me, the breakfast was ready for Alice to carry, dish by dish, to the white-clad table on the piazza. Not Raphael and Adam more enjoyed their watermelons, fox grapes, and late blueberries. And, in the long croon of the breakfast, we revenged ourselves for the haste with which it had been prepared. When we were well at table, a horn from the cabins below sounded the reveille for the drowsier workmen. Soon above the larches rose the blue of their smokes, and when we were at last nodding to the children, to say that they might leave the table, and Polly was folding her napkin as to say she wished we were gone, we would see tall Asaph Langdon, then foreman of the carpenters, sauntering up the valley with a roll of paper, or an adze, or a shingle with some calculations on it, with something on which he wanted Mr. Orcutt's directions for the day. An hour of nothing set the carnal machinery of the day a-going. We fed the horses, the cows, the pigs, and the hens. We collected the eggs and cleaned the hen houses and the barns. We brought in wood enough for the day's fire and water enough for the day's cooking and cleanliness. These heads describe what I and the children did. Polly's life during that hour was more mysterious. That great first hour of the day is devoted with women to the deepest arcana of the Eleusinian mysteries of the divine science of housekeeping. She who can meet the requisitions of that hour wisely and bravely conquers in the day's battle. But what she does in it, let no man try to say. It can be named but not described in the comprehensive formula, just stepping round. That hour well given to chores and to digestion. The children went to Mr. Orcutt's open-air school and I to my rustic study, a separate cabin with a rough square table in it and some book boxes equally rude. No man entered it excepting George and me. Here for 2 hours I worked undisturbed. How happy the world had it neither postman nor doorbell. Worked upon my traces of Sandemanianism in the 6th and 7th centuries, and then was ready to render such service to the cause and to George as the day might demand. Thus I rode to Lincoln or to Foxcroft to order supplies. I took my gun and lay in wait on chairback for a bear. I transferred to the hewn lumber the angles or bevels from the careful drawings. As best I could, I filled an apostle's part, and became all things to all these men around me. Happy those days. And thus the dam was built. In such Arcadian simplicity was reared the mighty wheel. Thus grew on each side the towers which were to support the flies. And thus, to our delight not unmixed with wonder, at last we saw those mighty flies begin to turn. Not in 1 day, nor in 10, but in a year or 2 of happy life, full of the joy of joys, the joy of eventful living. Yet for all this, $162,000 was not $197,000. Far less was it $250,000. And but for Jeff Davis and his crew, the brick moon would not have been born. But at last, Jeff Davis was ready. My preparations being completed, wrote General Beauregard, I opened fire on Fort Sumter. Little did he know it, but in that explosion, the brick moon also was lifted into the sky. Little did we know it, when 4 weeks after, George came up from the settlements, all excited with the news. The wheels had been turning now for 4 days, faster, of course, and faster. George had gone down for money to pay off the men, and he brought us up the news that the rebellion had begun. The last of this happy life, he said, the last, alas, of our dear moon. How little he knew and we. But he paid off the men, and they packed their traps and disappeared and, before 2 months were over, were in the lines before the enemy. George packed up, bade us sadly goodbye, and before a week had offered his service to Governor Fenton in Albany. For us it took rather longer, but we were soon packed. Polly took the children to her sister's, and I went on to the department to offer my service there. No sign of life left in number 9, but the 2 gigantic flywheels, moving faster and faster by day and by night, and accumulating power till it was needed. If only they would hold together till the moment came. So we all ground through the first slow year of the war. George in his place, I in mine, Brannan in his. We lifted as we could. But how heavy the weight seemed. It was in the 2nd year, when the 2nd large loan was placed, that Halliburton wrote to me. I got the letter, I think, at Hilton Head, that he had sold out every penny of our railroad stocks at the high prices which railroad stocks then bore, and had invested the whole $59,000 in the new governments. I could not call a board meeting, said Halliburton, for I am here only on leave of absence, and the rest are all away. But the case is clear enough. If the government goes up, the moon will never go up, and for one, I do not look beyond the veil. So he wrote to us all, and of course we all approved. So it was that Jeff Davis also served. Deep must that man go into the pit who does not serve, though unconscious. For thus it was that, in the 4th year of the war, when gold was at 290, Halliburton was receiving on his $59,000 17% interest in currency. Thus was it that, before the war was over, he had piled up, compounding his interest, more than 50% addition to his capital. Thus was it that, as soon as peace came, all his stocks were at a handsome percentage. Thus was it that, before I returned from South America, he reported to all the subscribers that the full $250,000 was secured. Thus was it that, When I returned after that long cruise of mine in the Florida, I found Polly and the children again at number 9. George there also, directing a working party of nearly 80 bricklayers and hodmen, the lower centrings well-nigh filled to their diameter, and the brick moon, to the eye, seeming almost half completed. Here it is that I regret most of all that I cannot print the working drawings with this paper. If you will cut open the seed vessel of Spergularia rubra, or any other carpel that has a free central placenta, and observe how the circular seeds cling around the circular center, you will have some idea of the arrangement of a transverse horizontal section of the completed moon. Lay 3 croquet balls on the piazza and call 1 or 2 of the children to help you poise 7 in one plane above the 3. Then let another child place 3 more above the 7, and you have the core of the moon completely. If you want a more poetical illustration, it was what Mr. Wordsworth calls a mass of conglobated bubbles undissolved. Any section through any diameter looked like an immense rose window of 6 circles grouped round a 7th. In truth, each of these sections would reveal the existence of 7 chambers in the moon, each a sphere itself, whose arches gave solidity to the whole, while yet of the whole moon, the greater part was air. In all there were 13 of these moonlets, if I am so to call them, though no one section, of course, would reveal so many. Sustained on each side by their groined arches, the surface of the whole moon was built over them and under them, simply 2 domes connected at the bases. The chambers themselves were made lighter by leaving large round windows or open circles in the parts of their vaults farthest from their points of contact, so that each of them looked not unlike the outer sphere of a Japanese ivory nest of concentric balls. You see, the object was to make a moon which, when left to its own gravity, should be fitly supported or braced within. Dear George was sure that by this constant repetition of arches, we should with the least weight unite the greatest strength. I believe it still, and experience has proved that there is strength enough. When I went up to number 9 on my return from South America, I found the lower centering up and half full of the working bees, who were really Celtic laborers, all busy in bringing up the lower half dome of the shell. This lower centering was of wood, in form exactly like a Roman amphitheater, if the seats of it be circular. On this the lower or inverted brick dome was laid. The whole fabric was on one of the terraces which were heaved up in some old geological cataclysm, when some lake gave way, and the Karatuk River was born. The level was higher than that of the top of the flywheels, which, with an awful velocity now, were circling in their wild career in the ravine below. 3 of the lowest moonlets, as I have called them, separate croquet balls, if you take my other illustration, had been completed. Their centrings had been taken to pieces and drawn out through the holes, and were now set up again with other new centrings for the 2nd story of cells. I was received with wonder and delight. I had telegraphed my arrival, but the dispatches had never been forwarded from Skowhegan. Of course, we all had a deal to tell, and for me, there was no end to inquiries which I had to make in turn. I was never tired of exploring the various spheres and the nameless spaces between them. I was never tired of talking with the laborers. All of us indeed became skillful bricklayers, and on a pleasant afternoon you might see Alice and Bertha and George and me all laying brick together. Polly sitting in the shade of some wall which had been built high enough and reading to us from Jean Ingelow or Monte Cristo or Jane Austen, while little Clara brought to us our mortar. Happily and lightly went by that summer. Halliburton and his wife made us a visit. Ben Brannan brought up his wife and children. Mrs. Halliburton herself put in the keystone to the central chamber, which had always been named G on the plans, and at her suggestion it was named Grace now, because her mother's name was Hannah. Before winter we had passed the diameter of I, J, and K, the 3 uppermost cells of all, and the surrounding shell was closing in upon them. On the whole, the funds had held out amazingly well. The wages had been rather higher than we meant, but the men had no chances at liquor or dissipation, and had worked faster than we expected, and with our new brick machines, we made brick inconceivably fast, while their quality was so good that dear George said there was never so little waste. We celebrated Thanksgiving of that year together, my family and his family, We had paid off all the laborers, and there were left of that busy village only Asaph Langdon and his family, Levi Jordan and Levi Ross, Horace Leonard and Seth Whitman with theirs. Theirs, I say, but Ross had no family. He was a nice young fellow who was there as Halliburton's representative to take care of the accounts and the payroll. Jordan was the head of the brick kilns, Leonard of the carpenters, and Whitman of the commissariat. And a good commissary Whitman was. We celebrated Thanksgiving together. Ah me! What a cheerful, pleasant time we had. How happy the children were together. Polly and I and our bairns were to go to Boston the next day. I was to spend the winter in one final effort to get $25,000 more if I could, with which we might paint the moon, or put on some ground felspathic granite dust in a sort of paste, which in its hot flight through the air might fuse into a white enamel. All of us who saw the moon were so delighted with its success that we felt sure the friends would not pause about this trifle. The rest of them were to stay there to watch the winter and to be ready to begin work the moment the snow had gone. Thanksgiving afternoon, how well I remember it. That good fellow Whitman came and asked Polly and me to visit his family in their new quarters. They had moved for the winter into cells B and E, so lofty, spacious, and warm, and so much drier than their log cabins. Mrs. Whitman, I remember, was very cheerful and jolly, made my children eat another piece of pie and stuffed their pockets with raisins. And then, with great ceremony and fun, we christened room B by the name of Bertha, and E Ellen, which was Mrs. Whitman's name. And the next day we bade them all goodbye, little thinking what we said, and with endless promises of what we would send and bring them in the spring. Here are the scraps of letters from Orcutt, dear fellow, which tell what more there is left to tell. December 10th. After you left, we were a little blue and hung round loose for a day or two. Sunday we missed you especially, but Asaph made a good substitute, and Mrs. Leonard led the singing. The next day we moved the Leonards into L and M, which we christened Leonard and Mary. Mary is for your wife. They are pretty dark but very dry. Leonard has swung hammocks as Whitman did. Asaph came to me Tuesday and said he thought they had better turn to and put a shed over the unfinished circle and so take occasion of warm days for dry work there. This we have done, and the occupation is good for us. December 25th. I have had no chance to write for a fortnight. The truth is that the weather has been so open that I let Asaph go down to number 7 and to Wilder's and engage 25 of the best of the men, who we knew were hanging round there. We have all been at work most of the time since, with very good success. H is now wholly covered in, and the centering is out. The men have named it Halliburton. I is well advanced. J is as you left it. The work has been good for us all morally. February 11th. We got your mail unexpectedly by some lumbermen on their way to the 9th Range. One of them has cut himself and takes this down. You will be amazed to hear that I and K are both done. We have had splendid weather and have worked half the time. We had a great jollification when K was closed in. Called it Kilpatrick, for Seth's old general. I wish you could just run up and see us. You must be quick if you want to put in any of the last licks. March 12th. Dear Fred, I have but an instant. By all means make your preparations to be here by the end of the month or early in next month. The weather has been faultless, you know. Asaph got in a dozen more men, and we have brought up the surface farther than you could dream. The ways are well forward, and I cannot see why, if the freshet hold off a little, we should not launch her by the 10th or 12th. I do not think it worth while to wait for paint or enamel. Telegraph Brannon that he must be here. You will be amused by our quarters. We, who were the last outsiders, move into A and D tomorrow for a few weeks. It is much warmer there. Ever yours, G.O. I telegraphed Brannon, and in reply he came with his wife and his children to Boston. I told him that he could not possibly get up there as the roads then were. But Ben said he would go to Skowhegan and take his chance there. He would, of course, communicate with me as soon as he got there. Accordingly, I got a note from him at Skowhegan saying he had hired a sleigh to go over to number 9, and in 4 days more I got this letter, March 27th. Dear Fred, I am most glad I came, and I beg you to bring your wife as soon as possible. The river is very full. The wheels, to which Leonard has added 2 auxiliaries, are moving as if they could not hold out long. The ways are all but ready, and we think we must not wait. Start with all hands as soon as you can. I had no difficulty in coming over from Skowhegan. We did it in 2 days. This note I sent at once to Halliburton, and we got all the children ready for a winter journey, as the spectacle of the launch of the moon was one to be remembered their life long. But it was clearly impossible to attempt at that season to get the subscribers together. Just as we started, this dispatch from Skowhegan was brought me. The last word I got from them: "Stop for nothing. There is a jam below us in the stream, and we fear back water." Orcut. Of course, we could not go faster than we could. We missed no connection. At Skowhegan, Halliburton and I took a cutter, leaving the ladies and children to follow at once in larger sleighs. We drove all night, changed horses at Prospect, and kept on all the next day. At number 7, we had to wait overnight. We started early in the morning, and came down the Spoonwood Hill at 4 in the afternoon, in full sight of our little village. It was quiet as the grave. Not a smoke, not a man, not an adze blow, nor the tick of a trowel. Only the gigantic flywheels were whirling as I saw them last. There was the lower Colosseum-like centering, somewhat as I first saw it. But where was the brick dome of the moon? "Good heavens! Has it fallen on them all?" cried I. Halliburton lashed the beast till he fairly ran down that steep hill. We turned a little point, and came out in front of the centering. There was no moon there. An empty amphitheater, with not a brick nor a splinter within. We were speechless. We left the cutter. We ran up the stairways to the terrace. We ran by the familiar paths into the centering. We came out upon the ways, which we had never seen before. These told the story too well. The ground and crushed surface of the timbers, scorched by the rapidity with which the moon had slid down, told that they had done the duty for which they were built. It was too clear that in some wild rush of the waters the ground had yielded a trifle. We could not find that the foundations had sunk more than 6 inches, but that was enough. In that fatal 6 inches decline of the centering, the moon had been launched upon the ways just as George had intended that it should be when he was ready. But it had slid, not rolled, down upon these angry flywheels, and in an instant, with all our friends, it had been hurled into the sky. "They have gone up," said Halliburton. "She has gone up," said I, both in one breath. And with a common instinct we looked up into the blue. But of course she was not there. Not a shred of letter or any other tidings could we find in any of the shanties. It was indeed 6 weeks since George and Fanny and their children had moved into Annie and Diamond, 2 unoccupied cells of the moon. So much more comfortable had the cells proved than the cabins, for winter life. Returning to number 7, we found there many of the laborers who were astonished at what we told them. They had been paid off on the 30th, and told to come up again on the 15th of April to see the launch. One of them, a man named Rob Shea, told me that George kept his cousin Peter to help him move back into his house the beginning of the next week. And that was the last I knew of any of them for more than a year. At first I expected, each hour, to hear that they had fallen somewhere. But time passed by, and of such a fall where man knows the world's surface, there was no tale. I answered, as best I could, the letters of their friends, by saying I did not know where they were and had not heard from them. My real thought was that if this fatal moon did indeed pass our atmosphere, all in it must have been burned to death in the transit. But this I whispered to no one save to Polly and Annie and Halliburton. In this terrible doubt I remained, till I noticed one day in the astronomical record the memorandum which you perhaps remember of the observation by Dr. Zitta of a new asteroid, with an enormous movement in declination. Part 3. Fulfillment. Looking back upon it now, it seems inconceivable that we said as little to each other as we did of this horrible catastrophe. That night we did not pretend to sleep. We sat in one of the deserted cabins, now talking fast, now sitting and brooding, without speaking perhaps for hours. Riding back the next day to meet the women and children, we still brooded, or we discussed this if, that if, and yet others. But after we had once opened it all to them, and when we had once answered the children's horribly naive questions as best we could, we very seldom spoke to each other of it again. It was too hateful, all of it, to talk about. I went round to Tom Coram's office one day and told him all I knew. He saw it was dreadful to me, and with his eyes full, just squeezed my hand and never said one word more. We lay awake nights, pondering and wondering, but hardly ever did I to Halliburton, or he to me, explain our respective notions as they came and went. I believe my general impression was that of which I have spoken, that they were all burned to death on the instant, as the little aerolite fused in its passage through our atmosphere. I believe Halliburton's thought more often was that they were conscious of what had happened, and gasped out their lives in 1 or 2 breathless minutes, so horribly long, as they shot outside of our atmosphere. But it was all too terrible for words, and that which we could not but think upon, in those dreadful waking nights, we scarcely whispered even to our wives. Of course I looked, and he looked for the miserable thing, but we looked in vain. I returned to the few subscribers the money which I had scraped together towards whitewashing the moon, shrouding its guilty face with innocent white, indeed. But we agreed to spend the wretched trifle of the other money, left in the treasury after paying the last bills, for the largest Alvan Clark telescope that we could buy, and we were fortunate in obtaining cheap a second-hand one, which came to the hammer when the property of the Shubael Academy was sold by the mortgagees. But we had, of course, scarce a hint whatever as to where the miserable object was to be found. All we could do was to carry the glass to number 9, to train it there on the meridian of number 9, and take turns every night in watching the field, in the hope that this child of sorrow might drift across it in its path of ruin. But, though everything else seemed to drift by from east to west, nothing came from south to north as we expected. For a whole month of spring, another of autumn, another of summer, and another of winter, did Halliburton and his wife and Polly and I glue our eyes to that eyeglass, from the twilight of evening to the twilight of morning, and the dead hulk never hove in sight. Wherever else it was, it seemed not to be on that meridian, which was where it ought to be and was made to be. Had ever any dead mass of matter wrought such ruin to its makers, and of its own stupid inertia so falsified all the prophecies of its birth? Oh, the total depravity of things! It was more than a year after the fatal night, if it all happened in the night, as I suppose, that, as I dreamily read through the astronomical record in the new reading room of the college library at Cambridge, I lighted on this scrap. Professor Carl Zitta of Breslau writes to the Astronomische Nachrichten to claim the discovery of a new asteroid observed by him on the night of March 31st. The asteroid observations were recorded as follows. On March 31st at 12 hours 53 minutes and 51.9 seconds mean time in Breslau, the apparent right ascension was 15 hours, 39 minutes, 52.32 seconds, and the apparent declination was minus 23 degrees, 50 minutes, 26.1 seconds. The recorded size was 12.9. On April 1st, at 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 2.1 seconds, the apparent right ascension remained 15 hours, 39 minutes, 52.32 seconds, and the apparent declination was minus 23 degrees, 9 minutes, 1.9 seconds. The size was again 12.9. He proposes for the asteroid the name of Phoebe. Dr. Zitta states that in the short period which he had for observing Phoebe, for an hour after midnight, her motion in RA seemed slight and her motion in declination very rapid. After this, however, for months, nay even to this moment, nothing more was heard of Dr. Zitta of Breslau. But one morning before I was up, Halliburton came banging at my door on D Street. The mood had taken him, as he returned from some private theatricals at Cambridge, to take the comfort of the new reading room at night, and thus express in practice his gratitude to the overseers of the college for keeping it open through all the 24 hours. Poor Halliburton, he did not sleep well in those times. Well, as he read away on the Astronomische Nachrichten itself, what should he find but this in German, which he copied for me, and then, all on foot in the rain and darkness, tramped over with to South Boston. The most enlightened head professor, Dr. Had Mellon, writes to the director of the Porpol Astronomic at St. Petersburg to claim the discovery of an asteroid in a very high southern latitude, of a wider inclination of the orbit, as will be noticed, than any asteroid yet observed. The planet's apparent right ascension was 21 hours, 20 minutes, 51.4 seconds. The planet's apparent declination was minus 39 degrees, 31 minutes, 11.9 seconds. This was measured with reference to the comparison star, whose right ascension is Alpha. Dr. Mellon publishes no separate second observation, but is confident that the declination is diminishing. Dr. Mellon suggests for the name of this extra-zodiacal planet Io, as appropriate to its wanderings from the accustomed ways of planetary life, and trusts that the very distinguished Herr Peters, the godfather of so many planets, will relinquish this name, already claimed for the asteroid 85, observed by him, September 15, 1865. I had run downstairs almost as I was, slippers and dressing gown being the only claims I had on society. But to me, as to Halliburton, this stuff about extra-zodiacal wandering blazed out upon the page, and though there was no evidence that the most enlightened found anything the next night, yet if his diminishing meant anything, there was, with Zitta's observation, whoever Zitta might be, something to start upon. We rushed upon some old bound volumes of the record and spotted the enlightened Milan. He was chief of a college at Taganrog, where perhaps they had a spyglass. This gave us the parallax of his observation. Breslau, of course, we knew, and so we could place Zitta's, and with these poor data I went to work to construct, if I could, an orbit for this Io Phoebe mass of brick and mortar. Halliburton, not strong in spherical trigonometry, looked out logarithms for me till breakfast, and, as soon as it would do, went over to Mrs. Bowden to borrow her telescope, ours being left at number 9. Mrs. Bowden was kind, as she always was, and at noon Halliburton appeared in triumph with the boxes on P. Nolan's job wagon. We always employ P in memory of dear old Phil. We got the telescope rigged and waited for night, only, alas, to be disappointed again. I had wandered somewhere else, and, with all our sweeping back and forth on the tentative curve I had laid out, Io would not appear. We spent that night in vain, but we were not going to give it up so. Phoebe might have gone round the world twice before she became Io, might have gone 3 times, 4, 5, 6, nay 600, who knew? Nay, who knew how far off Phoebe Io was, or Io Phoebe? We sent over for Annie, and she and Polly and George and I went to work again. We calculated in the next week 67 orbits on the supposition of so many different distances from our surface. I laid out on a paper, which we stuck up on the wall opposite the formula, and then one woman and one man attacked each set of elements, each having the logarithmic tables, and so in a week's working time, the 67 orbits were completed. 77 possible places for Io Phoebe to be in on the forthcoming Friday evening. Of these 67, 41 were observable above our horizon that night. She was not in one of the 41, nor near it. But despair, if Giotto be correct, is the chief of sins. So has he depicted her in the fresco of the arena in Padua. No sin, that, of ours. After searching all that Friday night, we slept all Saturday, sleeping after sweeping. We all came to the chapel Sunday, kept awake there, and taught our Sunday classes special lessons on perseverance. On Monday, we began again, and that week we calculated 67 more orbits. I am sure I do not know why we stopped at 67. All of these were on the supposition that the revolution of the brick moon, or Io Phoebe, was so fast that it would require either 15 days to complete its orbit, or 16 days or 17 days, and so on up to 81 days. And, with these orbits, on the next Friday we waited for the darkness. As we sat at tea, I asked if I should begin observing at the smallest or at the largest orbit, and there was a great clamor of diverse opinions. But little Bertha said, "Begin in the middle." "And what is the middle?" said George, chaffing the little girl. But she was not to be dismayed. She had been in and out all the week, and knew that the first orbit was of 15 days and the last of 81. And, with true Lincoln School precision, she said, the mean of the smallest orbit and the largest orbit is 48 days. "Amen," said I, as we all laughed. "On 48 days we will begin." Alice ran to the sheets, turned up that number, and read, "Right ascension 27 degrees, 11 minutes. South declination 34 degrees, 49 minutes. "Convenient place," said George. "Good omen, Bertha, my darling. If we find her there, Alice and Bertha and Clara shall all have new dolls." It was the first word of pleasantry that had been spoken about the horrid thing since Spoonwood Hill. Night came at last, We trained the glass on the fated spot. I bade Polly take the eyeglass. She did so, shook her head uneasily, screwed the tube northward herself a moment, and then screamed, "It is there! It is there! A clear disc, gibbous shape, and very sharp on the upper edge. Look, as big again as Jupiter." Polly was right. The brick moon was found. Now we had found it. We never lost it. Zita and G. Mellon, I suppose, had had foggy nights and stormy weather often. But we had someone at the eyeglass all that night, and before morning had very respectable elements, good measurements of angular distance when we got one, from another star in the field of our lowest power. For we could see her even with a good French opera glass I had, and with a night glass which I used to carry on the South Atlantic station. It certainly was an extraordinary illustration of Orcutt's engineering ability, that flying off as she did, without leave or license, she should have gained so nearly the orbit of our original plan, 9,000 miles from the Earth's center, 5,000 from the surface. He had always stuck to the hope of this, and on his very last tests of the flies he had said they were almost up to it. But for this accuracy of his, I can hardly suppose we should have found her to this hour, since she had failed, by what cause I then did not know, to take her intended place on the meridian of number 9. At 5,000 miles, the moon appeared as large as the largest satellite of Jupiter appears. And Polly was right in that first observation, when she said she got a good disk with that admirable glass of Mrs. Bowden. The orbit was not on the meridian of number 9, nor did it remain on any meridian, but it was very nearly south and north, an enormous motion in declination, with a very slight retrograde motion in right ascension. At 5,000 miles the moon showed as large as a circle 2 miles and a third in diameter would have shown on Old Thornbush, as we always called her older sister. We longed for an eclipse of Thornbush by B.M., but no such lucky chances on the cards in any place accessible to us for many years. Of course, with a moon so near us, the terrestrial parallax is enormous. Now you know, dear reader, that the gigantic reflector of Lord Rosse and the exquisite 15-inch refractors of the modern observatories eliminate from the chaotic rubbish heap of the surface of Old Thornbush much smaller objects than such a circle as I have named. If you have read Mr. Locke's amusing moon hoax as often as I have, you have those details fresh in your memory. As John Farrar taught us when all this began, and as I have said already, if there were a state house in Thornbush 200 feet long, the first Herschel would have seen it. His magnifying power was 60,450. That would have brought this deaf and dumb state house within some 40 miles. Go up on Mount Washington and see white sails 80 miles away, beyond Portland, with your naked eye, and you will find how well he would have seen that state house with his reflector. Lord Rosse's statement is that with his reflector he can see objects on Old Thornbush 252 feet long. If he can do that, he can see on our BM objects which are 5 feet long, and of course we were beside ourselves to get control of some instrument which had some approach to such power. Halliburton was for at once building a reflector at number 9, and perhaps he will do it yet, for Halliburton has been successful in his paper-making and lumbering. But I went to work more promptly. I remembered not an apothecary, but an observatory, which had been dormant, as we say of volcanoes, now for 10 or a dozen years, no matter why. The trustees had quarreled with the director, or the funds had given out, or the director had been shot at the head of his division. One of those accidents had happened, which will happen even in observatories which have 15-inch equatorials. And so the equatorial here had been left as useless as a cannon whose metal has been strained or its reputation stained in an experiment. The observatory at Tamworth, dedicated with such enthusiasm, another lighthouse in the skies, had been, so long as I have said, worthless to the world. To Tamworth, therefore, I traveled. In the neighborhood of the observatory I took lodgings. To the church where worshipped the family which lived in the observatory buildings I repaired. After 2 Sundays I established acquaintance with John Donald, the head of this family. On the evening of the 3rd, I made acquaintance with his wife in a visit to them. Before 3 Sundays more, he had recommended me to the surviving trustees as his successor as janitor to the buildings. He himself had accepted promotion and gone with his household to keep a store for Halliburton in North Ovid. I sent for Polly and the children to establish them in the janitor's rooms, and after writing to her, with trembling eye I waited for the brick moon to pass over the field of the 15-inch equatorial. Night came, I was sole alone. BM came, more than filled the field of vision, of course. But for that I was ready. Heavens, how changed! Red no longer, but green as a meadow in the spring. Still I could see, black on the green, the large 20-foot circles which I remembered so well, which broke the concave of the dome, and on the upper edge, were these palm trees? They were. No, they were hemlocks by their shape, and among them were moving to and fro flies? Of course, I cannot see flies, but something is moving, coming, going. 1, 2, 3, 10. There are more than 30 in all. They are men and women and their children. Could it be possible? It was possible. Orcutt and Brannan and the rest of them had survived that giddy flight through the ether and were going and coming on the surface of their own little world, bound to it by its own attraction and living by its own laws. As I watched, I saw one of them leap from that surface. He passed wholly out of my field of vision, but in a minute more or less returned. Why not? Of course the attraction of his world must be very small, while he retained the same power of muscle he had when he was here. They must be horribly crowded, I thought. No, they had 3 acres of surface, and there were but 37 of them. Not so much crowded as people are in Roxbury, not nearly so much as in Boston, and besides, these people are living underground and have the whole of their surface for their exercise. I watched their every movement as they approached the edge and as they left it. Often they passed beyond it, so that I could see them no more. Often they sheltered themselves from that tropical sun beneath the trees. Think of living on a world where from the vertical heat of the hottest noon of the equator to the twilight of the poles is a walk of only 50 paces. What atmosphere they had, to temper and diffuse those rays, I could not then conjecture. I knew that at 10:30 they would pass into the inevitable eclipse which struck them every night at this period of their orbit, and must, I thought, be a luxury to them, as recalling old memories of night when they were on this world. As they approached the line of shadow, some 15 minutes before it was due, I counted on the edge 37 specks arranged evidently in order, and at one moment, as by one signal, all 37 jumped into the air, high jumps. Again they did it, and again, then a low jump, then a high one. I caught the idea in a moment. They were telegraphing to our world, in the hope of an observer. Long leaps and short leaps, the long and short of Morse's telegraph alphabet, were communicating ideas. My paper and pencil had been, of course, before me. I jotted down the dispatch, whose language I knew perfectly. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. By I understand, they meant the responsive signal given in all telegraphy by an operator who has received and understood a message. As soon as this exercise had been 3 times repeated, they proceeded in a solid body, much the most apparent object I had had until now, to circle number 3, and then evidently descended into the moon. The eclipse soon began, but I knew the moon's path now, and followed the dusky coppery spot without difficulty. At 1:33 it emerged, and in a very few moments I saw the solid column pass from circle number 3 again, deploy on the edge again, and repeat 3 times the signal. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. Show I understand on the sawmill flat. It was clear that Orcutt had known that the edge of his little world would be most easy of observation, and that he had guessed that the moments of obscuration and of immersion were the moments when observers would be most careful. After this signal they broke up again, and I could not follow them. With daylight I sent off a dispatch to Halliburton, and grateful and happy in comparison, sank into the first sleep not haunted by horrid dreams, which I had known for years. Halliburton knew that George Orcutt had taken with him a good Dollond's refractor, which he had bought in London, of a 2-inch glass. He knew that this would give Orcutt a very considerable power, if he could only adjust it accurately enough to find number 9 in the 3D range. Orcutt had chosen well in selecting the sawmill flat, a large meadow, easily distinguished by the peculiar shape of the mill pond which we had made. Eager though Halliburton was to join me, he loyally took moneys, caught the first train to Skowhegan, and traveling thence, in 36 hours more was again descending Spoonwood Hill for the first time since our futile observations. The snow lay white upon the flat. With Rob Shea's help, he rapidly unrolled a piece of black cambric 20 yards long and pinned it to the crust upon the snow, another by its side, and another. Much cambric had he left. They had carried down with them enough for the funerals of 2 presidents. Halliburton showed the symbols for "I understand," but he could not resist also displaying, which are the dots and lines to represent OK, which, he says, is the shortest message of comfort. And not having exhausted the space on the flat, he and Robert, before night closed in, made a gigantic OK, 15 yards from top to bottom and in marks that were 15 feet through. I had telegraphed my great news to Halliburton on Monday night. Tuesday night he was at Skowhegan. Thursday night he was at Nutmer 9. Friday he and Rob stretched their cambric. Meanwhile, every day I slept. Every night I was glued to the eyepiece. 15 minutes before the eclipse every night this weird dance of leaps 200 feet high, followed by hops of 20 feet high, mingled always in the steady order I have described, spelt out the ghastly message, "Show I understand," on the sawmill flat. And every morning as the eclipse ended, I saw the column creep along to the horizon, and again as the duty of opening day spell out the same, "Show I understand," on the sawmill flat. They had done this twice in every 24 hours for nearly 2 years. For 3 nights steadily I read these signals twice each night, only these and nothing more. But Friday night all was changed. After attention, that dreadful show did not come, but this cheerful signal. Hurrah, all well. Air, food, and friends, what more can man require? Hurrah. How like George, how like Ben Brannan, how like George's wife, how like them all, and they were all well. Yet poor I could not answer. Nay, I could only guess what Halliburton had done. But I have never, I believe, been so grateful since I was born. After a pause, the united line of leapers resumed their jumps and hops. Long and short spelled out, "Your OK is twice as large as it need be." Of the meaning of this, lonely I had, of course, no idea. "I have a power of 700, continued George. "How did he get that?" "He has never told us. But this I can see, that all our analogies deceive us, of views of the sea from Mount Washington, or of the Boston State House from Wachusett. For in these views we look through 40 or 80 miles of dense terrestrial atmosphere. But Orcutt was looking nearly vertically through an atmosphere which was, most of it, rare indeed, and pure indeed, compared with its lowest stratum. In the record book of my observations, these dispatches are entered as 12 and 13. Of course, it was impossible for me to reply. All I could do was to telegraph these in the morning to Skowhegan, sending them to the care of the Moors, that they might forward them. But the next night showed that this had not been necessary. Friday night, George and the others went on for a quarter of an hour. Then they would rest, saying 2, 3, or whatever their next signal time would be. Before morning I had these dispatches. 14. Write to all hands that we are doing well. Langdon's baby is named Eo, and Leonard's is named Phoebe. How queer that was! What a coincidence! And they had some humor there. 15 was, our atmosphere stuck to us. It weighs 3/10 of an inch, our weight. 16. Our rainfall is regular as the clock. We have made a cistern of Kilpatrick. This meant the spherical chamber of that name. 17. Write to Darwin that he is all right. We began with lichens and have come as far as palms and hemlocks. These were the first night's messages. I had scarcely covered the eyeglasses and adjusted the equatorial for the day, when the bell announced the carriage in which Polly and the children came from the station to relieve me in my solitary service as janitor. I had the joy of showing her the good news. This night's work seemed to fill our cup. For all the day before, when I was awake, I had been haunted by the fear of famine for them. True, I knew that they had stored away in chambers H, I, and J the pork and flour which we had sent up for the workmen through the summer, and the corn and oats for the horses. But this could not last forever. Now, however, that it proved that in a tropical climate they were forming their own soil, developing their own palms, and eventually even their breadfruit and bananas, planting their own oats and maize, and developing rice, wheat, and all other cereals, harvesting these 6, 8, or 10 times, for aught I could see in one of our years. Why, then, there was no danger of famine for them. If, as I thought, they carried up with them heavy drifts of ice and snow in the 2 chambers which were not covered in when they started, why, they had waters in their firmament quite sufficient for all purposes of thirst and of ablution. And what I had seen of their exercise showed that they were in strength sufficient for the proper development of their little world. Polly had the messages by heart before an hour was over, and the little girls, of course, knew them sooner than she. Halliburton, meanwhile, had brought out the Schubel refractor, Alvin Clark, and by night of Friday was in readiness to see what he could see. Schubel, of course, gave him no such luxury of detail as did my 15-inch equatorial, but still he had no difficulty in making out groves of hemlock and the circular openings. And although he could not make out my 37 flies, still when 10:15 came he saw distinctly the black square crossing from Hole Mary to the edge and beginning its dervish dances. They were on his edge more precisely than on mine, for Orcutt knew nothing of Tamworth and had thought his best chance was to display for number 9. So was it that, at the same moment with me, Halliburton also was spelling out Orcutt & Co.'s joyous hurrah. "Teffin," lisped Celia, "prometh that you will look at yon moon, old Tombush, at the instant I do." So was it with me and Halliburton. He was of course informed long before the Moor's messenger came that, in Orcutt's judgment, 20 feet of length were sufficient for his signals. Orcutt's atmosphere, of course, must be exquisitely clear. So on Saturday, Robb and Halliburton pulled up all their cambric and arranged it on the flat again, in letters of 20 feet, in this legend: Ra. Al well. Halliburton said he could not waste flat or cambric on spelling. He had had all night since 10:30 to consider what next was most important for them to know, and a very difficult question it was, you will observe. They had been gone nearly 2 years, and much had happened. Which thing was, on the whole, the most interesting and important? He had said we were all well. What then? Did you never find yourself in the same difficulty? When your husband had come home from sea and kissed you and the children, and wondered at their size, did you never sit silent and have to think what you should say? Were you never fairly relieved when little Phil said, blustering, "I got 3 eggs today"? The truth is, that silence is very satisfactory intercourse, if we only know all is well. When de Sauty got his original cable going, he had not much to tell after all, only that consols were 1/4% higher than they were the day before. "Send me news," lisped he, poor lonely myth, from Bull's Bay to Valentia. "Send me news. They are mad for news. But how if there be no news worth sending? What do I read in my cable dispatch today? Only that the Harvard crew pulled at Putney yesterday, which I knew before I opened the paper, and that there had been a riot in Spain, which I also knew. Here is a letter just brought me by the mail from Moreau, Tazewell County, Iowa. It is written by Follansby, in a good, cheerful hand. How glad I am to hear from Follansby. Yes, but do I care one straw whether Follansby planted spring wheat or winter wheat? Not I. All I care for is Follansby's way of telling it. All these are the remarks by which Halliburton explains the character of the messages he sent in reply to George Orcutt's autographs, which were so thoroughly satisfactory. Should he say Mr. Borey had left the Navy Department and Mr. Robeson come in? Should he say the Lords had backed down on the disendowment bill? Should he say the telegraph had been landed at Duxbury? Should he say Ingham had removed to Tamworth? What did they care for this? What does anybody ever care for facts? Should he say that the state constable was enforcing the liquor law on whiskey, but was winking at lager? All this would take him a week in the most severe condensation, and for what good, as Halliburton asked. Yet these were the things that the newspapers told, and they told nothing else. There was a nice little poem of Jean Ingelow's in a transcript Halliburton had with him. He said he was really tempted to spell that out. It was better worth it than all the rest of the newspaper stuff, and would be remembered 1,000 years after that was forgotten. What they wanted, says Halliburton, was sentiment. That is all that survives and is eternal. So he and Robb laid out their cambric thus: raw, ale well, so glad. Halliburton hesitated whether he would not add power 5,000 to indicate the full power I was using at Tamworth, but he determined not to, and I think wisely. The convenience was so great of receiving the signal at the spot where it could be answered, that for the present he thought it best that they should go on as they did. That night, however, to his dismay, clouds gathered and a grim snowstorm began. He got no observations, and the next day it stormed so heavily that he could not lay his signals out. For me at Tamworth, I had a heavy storm all day, but at midnight it was clear, and as soon as the regular eclipse was past, George began with what we saw was an account of the great anaclysm which sent them there. You observe that Orcutt had far greater power of communicating with us than we had with him. He knew this, and it was fortunate he had, for he had, on his little world, much more of interest to tell than we had on our large one. 18. It stormed hard. We were all asleep and knew nothing till morning. The hammocks turned so slowly. Here was another revelation and relief. I had always supposed that if they knew anything before they were roasted to death, they had had one wild moment of horror. Instead of this, the gentle slide of the moon had not wakened them. The flight upward had been as easy as it was rapid. The change from one center of gravity to another had of course been slow, and they had actually slept through the whole. After the dancers had rested once, Orcutt continued. 19. We cleared EA in 2 seconds, I think. Our outer surface fused and cracked somewhat. So much the better for us. They moved so fast that the heat of their friction through the air could not propagate itself through the whole brick surface. Indeed, there could have been but little friction after the first 5 or 10 miles. By EA, he means Earth's atmosphere. His 20th dispatch is, I have no observations of ascent, but by theory our positive ascent ceased in 2 minutes 5 seconds when we fell into our proper orbit, which, as I calculate, is 5,109 miles from your mean surface. In all this, observe, George dropped no word of regret through these 5,000 miles. His 21st dispatch is, our rotation on our axis is made once in 7 hours, our axis being exactly vertical to the plane of our own orbit. But in each of your daily rotations we get sunned all round. Of course, they never had lost their identity with us, so far as our rotation and revolution went. Our inertia was theirs. All the fatal flywheels had given them was an additional motion in space of their own. This was the last dispatch before daylight of Sunday morning, and the terrible snowstorm of March sweeping our hemisphere cut off our communication with them, both at Tamworth and Number 9 for several days. But here was ample food for reflection. Our friends were in a world of their own, all 37 of them well, and it seemed they had 2 more little girls added to their number since they started. They had plenty of vegetables to eat, with prospect of new tropical varieties according to Dr. Darwin. Rob Shea was sure that they carried up hens. He said he knew Mrs. Whitman had several Middlesexes, and Mrs. Leonard 2 or 3 black Spanish fowls, which had been given her by some friends in Foxcroft. Even if they had not yet had time enough for these to develop into Alderneys and venison, they would not be without animal food. When at last it cleared off, Halliburton had to telegraph, repeat from 21, and this took all his cambric, though he had doubled his stock. Orcutt replied the next night, 22. I can see your storms. We have none. When we want to change climate, we can walk in less than a minute from midsummer to the depth of winter. But in the inside, we have 11 different temperatures, which do not change. On the whole, there is a certain convenience in such an arrangement. With Number 23, he went back to his story. It took us many days, 1 or 2 of our months, to adjust ourselves to our new condition. Greatest grief is that we are not on the meridian. Do you know why? Loyal George, he was willing to exile himself and his race from the most of mankind, if only the great purpose of his life could be fulfilled. But his great regret was that it was not fulfilled. He was not on the meridian. I did not know why. But Halliburton, with infinite labor, spelt out on the flat Psyche, Project, ad fin, by which he meant, see article projectiles in the cyclopedia at the end, and there indeed is the only explanation to be given. When you fire a shot, why does it ever go to the right or left of the plane in which it is projected? Dr. Hutton ascribes it to a whirling motion acquired by the bullet by friction with the gun. Euler thinks it due chiefly to the irregularity of the shape of the ball. In our case, the BM was regular enough, but on one side, being wholly unprepared for flight, she was heavily stored with pork and corn, while her other chambers had in some of them heavy drifts of snow, and some only a few men and women and hens. Before Orcutt saw Halliburton's advice, he had sent us 24 and 25. 24. We have established a Sandemanian church, and Brannan preaches. My son Edward and Alice Whitman are to be married this evening. This dispatch unfortunately did not reach Halliburton, though I got it. So, all the happy pair received for our wedding present was the advice to look in the cyclopedia at article projectiles near the end. 25 was, we shall act as you like it after the wedding. Deadhead tickets for all of the old set who will come. Actually, in 1 week's reunion we had come to joking. The next night we got 26. Alice says she will not read the cyclopedia in the honeymoon, but is much obliged to Mr. Halliburton for his advice. How did she ever know it was I? Wrote the matter-of-fact Halliburton to me. 27. Alice wants to know if Mr. Halliburton will not send here for some rags. Says we have plenty, with little need for clothes. And then dispatches began to be more serious again. Brannan and Orcutt had failed in the great scheme for the longitude, to which they had sacrificed their lives, if indeed it were a sacrifice to retire with those they love best to a world of their own. But nonetheless did they devote themselves, with the rare power of observation they had, to the benefit of our world. Thus, in 28, your North Pole is an open ocean. It was black, which we think means water, from August 1st to September 29th. Your South Pole is on an island bigger than New Holland. Your Antarctic continent is a great cluster of islands. 29. Your Nyanzas are only 2 of a large group of African lakes. The green of Africa, where there is no water, is wonderful at our distance. 30. We have not the last numbers of foul play. Tell us in a word or two how they got home. We can see what we suppose their island was. 31. We should like to know who proved right and he knew he was right. This was a good night's work, as they were then telegraphing. As soon as it cleared, Halliburton displayed best hopes. Carrier ducks. This was Halliburton's masterpiece. He had no room for more, however, and was obliged to reserve for the next day his answer to number 31, which was simply, she. A real equinoctial now parted us for nearly a week, and at the end of that time they were so low in our northern horizon that we could not make out their signals. We and they were obliged to wait till they had passed through 2/3 of their month before we could communicate again. I used the time in speeding to number 9. We got a few carpenters together and arranged on the flat 2 long movable black platforms, which ran in and out on railroad wheels on tracks from under green platforms, so that we could display one or both as we chose, and then withdraw them. With this apparatus we could give 45 signals in a minute, corresponding to the line and dot of the telegraph, and thus could compass some 20 letters in that time, and make out perhaps 250 words in an hour. Halliburton thought that, with some improvements, he could send one of Mr. Buchanan's messages up in 37 working nights. Part 4. Independence. I own to a certain mortification in confessing that after this interregnum, forced upon us by so long a period of non-intercourse, we never resumed precisely the same constancy of communication as that which I have tried to describe at the beginning. The apology for this benumbment, if I may so call it, will suggest itself to the thoughtful reader. It is indeed astonishing to think that we so readily accept a position when we once understand it. You buy a new house. You are fool enough to take out a staircase that you may put in a bathing room. This will be done in a fortnight, everybody tells you, and then everybody begins. Plumbers, masons, carpenters, plasterers, skimmers, bell hangers, speaking tube men, men who make furnace pipe, paper hangers, men who scrape off the old paper, and other men who take off the old paint with alkali, gas men, city water men, and painters begin. To them are joined a considerable number of furnace men's assistants, stovepipe men's assistants, masons' assistants, and hodmen who assist the assistants of the masons, the furnace men, and the pipe men. For a day or two these all take possession of the house and reduce it to chaos. In the language of Scripture, they enter in and dwell there. Compare, for the details, Matt 45. Then you revisit it at the end of the fortnight and find it in chaos with the woman whom you employed to wash the attics, the only person on the scene. You ask her where the paper hanger is, and she says he can do nothing because the plaster is not dry. You ask why the plaster is not dry, and are told it is because the furnace man has not come. You send for him, and he says he did come, but the stovepipe man was away. You send for him, and he says he lost a day in coming, but that the mason had not cut the right hole in the chimney. You go and find the mason, and he says they are all fools, and that there is nothing in the house that need take 2 days to finish. Then you curse, not the day in which you were born, but the day in which bathrooms were invented. You say truly that your father and mother, from whom you inherit every moral and physical faculty you prize, never had a bathroom till they were past 60, yet they thrived and their children. You sneak through back streets, fearful lest your friends shall ask you when your house will be finished. You are sunk in wretchedness, unable even to read your proofs accurately, far less able to attend the primary meetings of the party with which you vote, or to discharge any of the duties of a good citizen. Life is wholly embittered to you, yet 6 weeks after you sit before a soft coal fire in your new house, with the feeling that you have always lived there. You are not even grateful that you are there. You have forgotten the plumber's name, and if you met in the street that nice carpenter that drove things through, you would just nod to him, and would not think of kissing him or embracing him. Thus completely have you accepted the situation. Let me confess that the same experience is that with which, at this writing, I regard the brick moon. It is there in ether. I cannot keep it. I cannot get it down. I cannot well go to it, though possibly that might be done, as you will see. They are all very happy there, much happier, as far as I can see, than if they lived in 6th floors in Paris, in lodgings in London, or even in tenement houses in Phoenix Place, Boston. There are disadvantages attached to their position, but there are also advantages, and what most of all tends to our accepting the situation is that there is nothing that we can do about it, as Q says, but to keep up our correspondence with them, and to express our sympathies. For them, their responsibilities are reduced in somewhat the same proportion as the gravitation which binds them down, I had almost said to earth, which binds them down to brick, I mean. This decrease of responsibility must make them as light-hearted as the loss of gravitation makes them light-bodied. On which point I ask for a moment's attention, and as these sheets leave my hand, an illustration turns up which well serves me. It is the 23rd of October. Yesterday morning, all wakeful women in New England were sure there was someone under the bed. This is a certain sign of an earthquake, and when we read the evening newspapers, we were made sure there had been an earthquake. What blessings the newspapers are, and how much information they give us. Well, they said it was not very severe here, but perhaps it was more severe elsewhere. Hopes really arising in the editorial mind that in some Caracas or Lisbon all churches and the cathedral might have fallen. I did not hope for that, but I did have just the faintest feeling that if it should prove that the world had blown up into 6 or 8 pieces, and they had gone off into separate orbits, life would be vastly easier for all of us, on whichever bit we happen to be. That thing has happened, they say, once. Whenever the big planet between Mars and Jupiter blew up and divided himself into 102 or more asteroids, the people on each one only knew there had been an earthquake when and after they read their morning journals. And then, all that they knew at first was that telegraphic communication had ceased beyond, say, 200 miles. Gradually, people and dispatches came in, who said that they had parted company with some of the other islands and continents. But as I say, on each piece the people not only weighed much less, but were much lighter-hearted, had less responsibility. Now will you imagine the enthusiasm here at Miss Hale's school, when it should be announced that geography in future would be confined to the study of the region east of the Mississippi and west of the Atlantic, the earth having parted at the seams so named. No more study of Italian, German, French, or Sclavonic, the people speaking those languages being now in different orbits or other worlds. Imagine also the superior ease of the office work of the ABCFM and kindred societies, the duties of instruction and civilizing, of evangelizing in general, being reduced within so much narrower bounds. For you and me also, who cannot decide what Mr. Gladstone ought to do with the land tenure in Ireland, and who distress ourselves so much about it in conversation, What a satisfaction to know that Great Britain is flung off with one rate of movement, Ireland with another, and the Isle of Man with another, into space, with no more chance of meeting again than there is, that you shall have the same hand at whist tonight that you had last night. Even Victoria would sleep easier, and I am sure Mr. Gladstone would. Thus, I say, were Orcutt's and Brannan's responsibilities so diminished that after the first I began to see that their contracted position had its decided compensating ameliorations. In these views, I need not say, the women of our little circle never shared. After we got the new telegraph arrangement in good running order, I observed that Polly and Annie Halliburton had many private conversations, and the secret came out one morning, when, rising early in the cabins, we men found they had deserted us, and then, going in search of them, found them running the signal boards in and out as rapidly as they could, to tell Mrs. Brannan and the bride, Alice Orcutt, that flounces were worn an inch and a half deeper, and that people trimmed now with harmonizing colors and not with contrasts. I did not say that I believed they wore fig leaves in BM, but that was my private impression. After all, it was hard to laugh at the girls, as these ladies will be called, should they live to be as old as Helen was when she charmed the Trojan Senate. That was 93, if Heine be right in his calculations. It was hard to laugh at them because this was simple benevolence, and the same benevolence led to a much more practical suggestion when Polly came to me and told me she had been putting up some baby things for little Io and Phoebe, and some playthings for the older children, and she thought we might send up a bundle. Of course we could. There were the flies still moving, or we might go ourselves. And here the reader must indulge me in a long parenthesis. I beg him to bear me witness that I never made one before. This parenthesis is on the tense that I am obliged to use in sending to the press these minutes. The reader observes that the last transactions mentioned happen in April and May, 1871. Those to be narrated are the sequence of those already told. Speaking of them in 1870 with the coarse tenses of the English language is very difficult. One needs for accuracy a sure future, a second future, Apollo post-future, and Apollo ante future, none of which does this language have. Failing this, one would be glad of an aorist, tense without time, if the grammarians will not swoon at hearing such language. But the English tongue hath not that either. Doth the learned reader remember that the Hebrew, language of history and prophecy, hath only a past and a future tense, but hath no present? Yet that language succeeded tolerably in expressing the present griefs or joys of David and of Solomon. Bear with me then, O critic, if even in 1870 I use the so-called past tenses in narrating what remaineth of this history up to the summer of 1872. End of the parenthesis. On careful consideration, however, no one volunteers to go. To go, if you observe, would require that a man envelop himself thickly in asbestos or some similar non-conducting substance, leap boldly on the rapid flies, and so be shot through the Earth's atmosphere in 2 seconds and a fraction, carrying with him all the time, in a non-conducting receiver, the condensed air he needed, and landing quietly on BM by a pre-calculated orbit. At the bottom of our hearts, I think we were all afraid. Some of us confessed to fear, others said, and said truly, that the population of the moon was already dense, and that it did not seem reasonable or worthwhile on any account to make it denser, nor has any movement been renewed for going. But the plan of the bundle of things seemed more feasible, as the things would not require oxygen. The only precaution seemed to be that which was necessary for protecting the parcel against combustion as it shot through the Earth's atmosphere. We had not asbestos enough. It was at first proposed to pack them all in one of Professor Horsford's safes, but when I telegraphed this plan to Orcutt, he demurred. Their atmosphere was but shallow, and with a little too much force the corner of the safe might knock a very bad hole in the surface of his world. He said if we would send up first a collection of things of no great weight, but of considerable bulk, he would risk that, but he would rather have no compact metals. I satisfied myself, therefore, with a plan which I still think good. Making the parcel up in heavy old woolen carpets, and cording it with worsted cords, we would case it in a carpet bag larger than itself, and fill in the interstice with dry sand, as our best non-conductor. Cording this tightly again, we would renew the same casing with more sand, and so continually offer surfaces of sand and woolen till we had 5 separate layers between the parcel and the air. Our calculation was that a perceptible time would be necessary for the burning and disintegrating of each sandbag. If each one, on the average, would stand 2/5 of a second, the inner parcel would get through the Earth's atmosphere unconsumed. If, on the other hand, they lasted a little longer, the bag, as it fell on BM, would not be unduly heavy. Of course, we could take their night for the experiment, so that we might be sure they should all be in bed and out of the hat way. We had very funny and very merry times in selecting things important enough and at the same time bulky and light enough to be safe. Alice and Bertha at once insisted that there must be room for the children's playthings. They wanted to send the most approved of the old ones, and to add some new presents. There was a woolly sheep in particular, and a watering pot that Rose had given Fanny, about which there was some sentiment. Boxes of dominoes, packs of cards, magnetic fishes, bows and arrows, checkerboards, and croquet sets. Polly and Annie were more considerate. Down to Coleman and Company they sent an order for pins, needlehooks and eyes, buttons, tapes, and I know not what essentials. India rubber shoes for the children Mrs. Halliburton insisted on sending. Halliburton himself bought open-eye, shut-eye dolls, though I felt that wax had been, since Icarus's days, the worst article in such an adventure. For the babies he had India rubber rings. He had tin cows and carved wooden lions for the bigger children, drawing tools for those older yet, and a box of crochet tools for the ladies. For my part, I piled in literature, a set of my own works, the legislative reports of the state of Maine, Jean Ingelow, as I said or intimated, and both volumes of The Earthly Paradise. All these were packed in sand, bagged and corded, bagged, sanded and corded again, yet again and again, 5 times. Then the whole awaited Orcutt's orders and our calculations. At last the moment came. We had, at Orcutt's order, reduced the revolutions of the flies to 7,230, which was, as nearly as he knew, the speed on the fatal night. We had soaked the bag for near 12 hours, and at the moment agreed upon, rolled it on the flies and saw it shot into the air. It was so small that it went out of sight too soon for us to see it take fire. Of course, we watched eagerly for signal time. They were all in bed on BM when we let fly, but the dispatch was a sad disappointment. 107, nothing has come through but 2 croquet balls and a China horse. But we shall send the boys hunting in the bushes, and we may find more. 108, 2 Harpers and an Atlantic badly singed, but we can read all but the parts which were most dry. 109, we see many small articles revolving round us which may perhaps fall in. They never did fall in, however. The truth was that all the bags had burned through. The sand, I suppose, went to its place, wherever that was. And all the other things in our bundle became little asteroids or aerolites in orbits of their own, except a well-disposed score or two, which persevered far enough to get within the attraction of Brick Moon, and to take to revolving there, not having hit quite square, as the croquet balls did. They had 5 volumes of the Congressional Globe, whirling round like bats within 100 feet of their heads. Another body, which I'm afraid was the Ingham Papers, flew a little higher, not quite so heavy. Then there was an absurd procession of the woolly sheep, a China cow, a pair of India rubbers, a lobster. Halliburton had chosen to send a wooden lion, the wax doll, a Salter's balance, the New York Observer, the bow and arrows, a Nuremberg nanny goat, Rose's watering pot, and the magnetic fishes, which gravely circled round and round them slowly and made the petty zodiac of their petty world. We have never sent another parcel since, but we probably shall at Christmas, gauging the flies perhaps to 1 revolution more. The truth is that although we have never stated to each other in words our difference of opinion or feeling, there is a difference of habit of thought in our little circle as to the position which the BM holds. Somewhat similar is the difference of habit of thought in which different statesmen of England regard their colonies. Is BM a part of our world, or is it not? Should its inhabitants be encouraged to maintain their connections with us, or is it better for them to accept the situation and gradually wean themselves from us and from our affairs? It would be idle to determine this question in the abstract. It is perhaps idle to decide question of casuistry in the abstract, but in practice, there are constantly arising questions which really require some decision of this abstract problem for their solution. For instance, when that terrible breach occurred in the Sandemanian church, which parted it into the old school and new school parties, Halliburton thought it very important that Brannan and Orcutt and the church in BM under Brannan's ministry should give in their adhesion to our side. Their church would count one more in our registry, and the weight of its influence would not be lost. He therefore spent 8 or 9 days in telegraphing from the early proofs a copy of the address of the Chautauqua Synod to Brannan, and asked Brannan if he were not willing to have his name signed to it when it was printed. And the only thing which Halliburton takes sorely in the whole experience of the Brick Moon from the beginning is that neither Orcutt nor Brannan has ever sent one word of acknowledgement of the dispatch. Once, when Halliburton was very low-spirited, I heard him even say that he believed they had never read a word of it, and that he thought he and Rob Shea had had their labor for their pains in running the signals out and in. Then he felt quite sure that they would have to establish civil government there. So he made up an excellent collection of books, Delolme on the British Constitution, Montesquieu on laws, Story Kent, John Adams, and all the authorities here, with 10 copies of his own address, delivered before the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Society of Podunk on the abnormal truths of social order. He telegraphed to know what night he should send them, and Orcutt replied, 129. Go to thunder with your old law books. We have not had a primary meeting nor a justice court since we have been here, and DV we never will have. Halliburton says this is as bad as the state of things in Kansas, when, because Frank Pierce would not give them any judges or laws to their mind, they lived a year or so without any. Orcutt added in his next dispatch, 130. Have not you any new novels? Send up Scribe in the Arabian Nights and Robinson Crusoe in the Three Guardsmen and Mrs. Whitney's books. We have Thackeray and Miss Austen. When he read this, Halliburton felt as if they were not only light-footed but light-headed, and he consulted me quite seriously as to telegraphing to them Pycroft's course of reading. I coaxed him out of that, and he satisfied himself with a serious expostulation with George as to the way in which their young folks would grow up. George replied by telegraphing Brannan's last sermon, I Thessalonians Ive 2. The sermon had 4 heads, must have occupied an hour and a half in delivery, and took 5 nights to telegraph. I had another engagement, so that Halliburton had to sit it all out with his eye to Shubael, and he has never entered on that line of discussion again. It was as well, perhaps, that he got enough of it. The women have never had any misunderstandings. When we had received 200 or 300 dispatches from BM, Annie Halliburton came to me and said, in that pretty way of hers, that she thought they had a right to their turn again. She said this lore about the Albert Nyanza and the North Pole was all very well, but for her part, she wanted to know how they lived, what they did and what they talked about, whether they took summer journeys, and how and what was the form of society where 37 people lived in such close quarters. This about the form of society was merely wool pulled over my eyes. So she said she thought her husband and I had better go off to the biennial convention at Assumpink, as she knew we wanted to do, and she and Bridget and Polly and Cordelia would watch for the signals and would make the replies. She thought they would get on better if we were out of the way. So we went to the convention, as she called it, which was really not properly a convention, but the 45th Biennial General Synod, and we left the girls to their own sweet way. Shall I confess that they kept no record of their own signals, and did not remember very accurately what they were? I was not going to keep a string of says I's and says she's, said Polly boldly. It shall not be written on my tomb that I have left more annals for people to file or study or bind or dust or catalogue. But they told us that they had begun by asking the Bricks if they remembered what Maria Theresa said to her ladies-in-waiting. Quicker than any signal had ever been answered, George Orcutt's party replied from the moon, we hear and we obey. Then the womenkind had it all to themselves. The Brick women explained at once to our girls that they had sent their men round to the other side to cut ice, and that they were manning the telescope and running the signals for themselves, and that they could have a nice talk without any bother about the law books or the magnetic pole. As I say, I do not know what questions Polly and Annie put, but, to give them their due, they had put on paper a coherent record of the results arrived at in the answers. Though what were the numbers of the dispatches, or in what order they came, I do not know, for the session of the synod kept us at Assumpink for 2 or 3 weeks. Maria Theresa's husband, Francis, Duke of Tuscany, was hanging about loose one day, and the Empress, who had got a little tired, said to the maids of honor, "Girls, whenever you marry, take care and choose a husband who has something to do outside of the house." Mrs. Brannan was the spokesman. We tried a good many experiments about day and night. It was very funny at first not to know when it would be light and when dark, for really the names day and night do not express a great deal for us. Of course, the pendulum clocks all went wrong till the men got them overhauled, and I think watches and clocks both will soon go out of fashion. But we have settled down on much the old hours, getting up, without reference to daylight, by our great gong at your 8 o'clock. But when the eclipse season comes, we vary from that for signaling. We still make separate families, and Alice's is the 7th. We tried hotel life, and we liked it, for there has never been the first quarrel here. You can't quarrel here where you are never sick, never tired, and need not be ever hungry. But we were satisfied that it was nicer for the children and for all round to live separately and come together at parties, to church, at signal time, and so on. We had something to say then, something to teach, and something to learn. Since the carices developed so nicely into flax, we have had one great comfort, which we had lost before, in being able to make and use paper. We have had great fun, and we think the children have made great improvement in writing novels for the Union. The Union is the old Union for Christian work that we had in dear old number 9. We have 2 serial novels going on, one called Diana of Caratuck, and the other called Ups and Downs. The first by Levi Ross, and the other by my Blanche. They are really very good, and I wish we could send them to you, but they would not be worth dispatching. We get up at 8, dress, and fix up at home, a sniff of air, as people choose, breakfast, and then we meet for prayers outside. Where we meet depends on the temperature, for we can choose any temperature we want, from boiling water down, which is convenient. After prayers, an hour's talk, lounging, walking, and so on. No flirting, but a favorite time with the young folks. Then comes work. 3 hours head work is the maximum in that line. Of women's work, as in all worlds, there are 24 in one of your days, but for my part I like it. Farmers and carpenters have their own laws, as the light serves in the seasons. Dinner is 7 hours after breakfast began, always an hour long, as breakfast was. Then every human being sleeps for an hour. Big gong again, and we ride, walk, swim, telegraph, or what not, as the case may be. We have no horses yet, but the Shanghais are coming up into very good dodos and ostriches, quite big enough for a trot for the children. Only 2 persons of a family take tea at home. The rest always go out to tea without invitation. At 8 p.m., big gong again, and we meet in Grace, which is the prettiest hall, church, concert room that you ever saw. We have singing, lectures, theater, dancing, talk, or what the mistress of the night determines, till the curfew sounds at 10, and then we all go home. Evening prayers are in the separate households, and every one is in bed by midnight. The only law on the statute book is that everyone shall sleep 9 hours out of every 24. Only one thing interrupts this general order. 3 taps on the gong means telegraph, and then I tell you we are all on hand. You cannot think how quickly the days and years go by. Of course, however, as I said, this could not last. We could not subdue our world and be spending all our time in telegraphing our dear BM. Could it be possible? Perhaps it was possible. That they there had something else to think of and to do besides attending to our affairs? Certainly their indifference to Grant's 4th proclamation and to Mr. Fish's celebrated protocol in the Tahiti business looked that way. Could it be that that little witch of a Belle Brannan really cared more for their performance of Midsummer Night's Dream, or her father's birthday, than she cared for that pleasant little account I telegraphed up to all the children of the way we went to muster when we were boys together? Ah, well, I ought not to have supposed that all worlds were like this old world. Indeed, I often say this is the queerest world I ever knew. Perhaps theirs is not so queer, and it is I who am the oddity. Of course, it could not last. We just arranged correspondence days when we would send to them, and they to us. I was meanwhile turned out from my place at Tamworth Observatory. Not but I did my work well, and Polly hers. The observer's room was a miracle of neatness. The children were kept in the basement. Visitors were received with great courtesy, and all the fees were sent to the treasurer. He got $3.11 one summer. That was the year General Grant came there, and that was the largest amount that they ever received from any source but begging. I was not unfaithful to my trust, nor was it for such infidelity that I was removed. No, but it was discovered that I was a Sandemanian, a glassite, as in derision I was called. The annual meeting of the trustees came round. There was a large mechanics fair in Tamworth at the time, and an agricultural convention. There was no horse race at the convention, but there were 2 competitive examinations in which running horses competed with each other, and trotting horses competed with each other, and $5,000 was given to the best runner and the best trotter. These causes drew all the trustees together. The Rev. Cephas Philpotts presided. His doctrines with regard to free agency were considered much more sound than mine. He took the chair in that pretty observatory parlor, which Polly had made so bright with smilax and ivy. Of course I took no chair. I waited, as a janitor should, at the door. Then a brief address. Dr. Philpotts trusted the observatory might always be administered in the interests of science, of true science, of that science which rightly distinguishes between unlicensed liberty and true freedom, between the unrestrained volition and the freedom of the will. He became eloquent. He became noisy. He sat down. Then 3 other men spoke, on similar subjects. Then the executive committee which had appointed me was dismissed with thanks. Then a new executive committee was chosen, with Dr. Philpotts at the head. The next day I was discharged, and the next week the Philpotts family moved into the observatory, and their second girl now takes care of the instruments. I returned to the cure of souls and to healing the hurt of my people. On observation days somebody runs down to number 9, and by means of Schubel communicates with BM. We love them, and they love us all the same. Nor do we grieve for them as we did. Coming home from Pigeon Cove in October with those nice Wadsworth people, we fell to talking as to the why and wherefore of the summer life we had led. How was it that it was so charming, and why were we a little loath to come back to more comfortable surroundings? "I hate the school," said George Wadsworth. "I hate the making calls," said his mother. "I hate the office hour," said her poor husband. "If there were only a dozen I would not mind, but 1,700,000 in 60 minutes is too many." So that led to asking how many of us there had been at Pigeon Cove. The children counted up all the 6 families, the Halliburtons, the Wadsworths, the Pontefracts, the Midges, the Haces, and the Inghams, and the 2 good-natured girls, 37 in all, and the 2 babies born this summer. "Really," said Mrs. Wadsworth, "I have not spoken to a human being besides these since June, and what is more, Mrs. Ingham, I have not wanted to. We have really lived in a little world of our own." "World of our own?" Polly fairly jumped from her seat, to Mrs. Wadsworth's wonder. "So we had lived in a world of our own." Polly reads no newspaper since the Sandemanian was merged. She has a letter or 2 tumble in sometimes, but not many, and the truth was that she had been more secluded from General Grant and Mr. Gladstone and the Khedive and the rest of the important people than had Brannan or Ross or any of them, and it had been the happiest summer she had ever known. Can it be possible that all human sympathies can thrive, and all human powers be exercised, and all human joys increase if we live with all our might with the 30 or 40 people next to us, telegraphing kindly to all other people, to be sure? Can it be possible that our passion for large cities and large parties and large theaters and large churches develops no faith nor hope nor love which would not find aliment and exercise in a little world of our own? Thanks for listening to The Brick Moon by Edward Everett Hale here on Archivum Infinitum. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, especially if you're interested in listening to more forgotten imaginative tales in the future. Stay tuned for our next video. See you next time.